Fall asleep to the entire story of Robert the Bruce, the king who won Scotland's freedom. Imagine Scotland at night. Not the Scotland of postcards, not the Scotland of tourist brochures, not the Scotland of bagpipes and dramatic mountain ranges glowing beneath a suspiciously perfect sunset. Imagine the real landscape as it might have looked more than 700 years ago. There are no electric lights in the valleys. No roads humming with cars. No distant orange glow from a city staining the clouds. There is only darkness, broken here and there by the tiny yellow flicker of a fire behind a stone wall. The wind moves across the hills. It bends the grass. It pushes cold rain against the roofs of small houses. Somewhere in the distance, perhaps, a horse shifts its weight inside a wooden stable. A dog lifts its head. A fire crackles. A man coughs in the darkness. And above all of it, there is the enormous Scottish sky. It is the sort of sky that makes human beings feel very small. Which is probably useful when you are about to begin the story of Robert the Bruce. Because Robert the Bruce spent much of his life being reminded that he was, in fact, a very small person standing beneath a very large collection of problems. He was born in 1274, probably at Turnberry Castle in Ayrshire, into one of the most powerful noble families in Scotland. His family had land, connections, ambition, and a rather inconvenient relationship with the Scottish crown. And within a few decades, this man would become King of Scots. He would lose battles. He would lose castles. He would lose allies. He would be hunted across the country. His family would be imprisoned. Several of his brothers would be executed. His kingdom would be invaded. He would be branded a traitor. He would be excommunicated. And for a while, if you had been looking at the situation objectively, you might reasonably have concluded that Robert Bruce's political career had been an unfortunate experiment that was about to end rather badly. And yet, somehow, he survived. More than survived. He eventually defeated the English king's army at Bannockburn in 1314, broke the military power that had threatened Scotland for years, secured recognition of Scottish independence, and died in 1329 as the undisputed King of Scots. That is the familiar version of the story. But tonight, we are going to take the long way around. Because Robert Bruce's story did not begin with a crown. It began with a succession crisis. And before we get anywhere near Bannockburn, we need to sit quietly for a while in medieval Scotland. So let the fire settle. Let the rain continue outside. And somewhere, far beyond the window, imagine the dark hills of Ayrshire. The year is 1274. Robert Bruce has just been born. And nobody knows what is coming. Scotland before Robert. Scotland in the late 13th century was not a single, neatly organized political machine. It was a kingdom, certainly. But kingdoms in medieval Europe were less like modern countries and more like enormous, complicated webs of relationships. Kings ruled. But nobles held land. Bishops held influence. Clans and families maintained loyalties. Castles controlled roads and valleys. And everyone, from the greatest lord to the smallest tenant farmer, existed inside a hierarchy of obligations that could become extremely confusing after dinner. The Bruce family was part of this world. Their ancestry was connected to Normandy, England, and Scotland, and over generations the family had accumulated substantial lands and titles. Robert's grandfather, also named Robert Bruce, had even been one of the major competitors for the Scottish crown during the Great Succession Crisis that followed the death of King Alexander III. That succession crisis is where our story really begins. Because Scotland had a problem. A very serious one. There was no adult king. Alexander III had been King of Scots for decades, and under him Scotland had enjoyed a relatively stable period. But medieval stability was often the sort of thing you only appreciated after it disappeared. In 1286, Alexander died after falling from his horse on the coast of Fife. And suddenly Scotland needed a monarch. The obvious heir was his granddaughter Margaret, known to history as the Maid of Norway. Unfortunately, Margaret was a child, and she lived in Norway, which was not exactly next door. So Scotland entered a period of uncertainty. The great nobles began looking toward the future. Two families had particularly strong claims to the throne: the Balliols and the Bruces. Robert Bruce's grandfather was one of the claimants. John Balliol was another. Neither man could simply walk into Edinburgh Castle, point at the throne, and say, "Mine!" Medieval succession did not work quite that conveniently. Instead, the dispute became an international political problem. And into this uncertainty stepped the most powerful king in the British Isles, Edward I of England. Edward was an imposing figure. He was tall by medieval standards, physically formidable, experienced in warfare, and intensely determined. He had already spent years extending English royal authority. And now Scotland was asking him to help settle its succession. This was, in retrospect, a rather dangerous invitation. Edward agreed to help. But he wanted something in return. He wanted recognition of his superiority over the Scottish kingdom. In other words, he wanted Scotland to acknowledge him as overlord. The Scots, understandably, were not thrilled. But they were divided. And division is one of the oldest friends of political power. Edward eventually chose John Balliol as king. Balliol became King of Scots in 1292. And almost immediately, his relationship with Edward became miserable. Edward expected obedience. Balliol wanted to rule. The Scottish nobility wanted to preserve their own position. And somewhere beneath all of this was a very simple problem. England was becoming more powerful. Scotland did not want to become English. Edward did not particularly care what Scotland wanted. And that was the beginning of the storm. The hammer of the Scots. Edward I did not initially think of himself as a conqueror in a simple sense. He believed he possessed rights over Scotland. The exact legal and political details were complicated, because medieval kings had a remarkable talent for finding ancient documents whenever those documents happened to support whatever they already wanted. But beneath the legal arguments was power. Edward had an army. He had money. He had experienced administrators. He had castles. And he was willing to use all of them. When John Balliol resisted him, Edward invaded Scotland in 1296. The campaign was devastating. Berwick was attacked. The English army moved north. Scottish resistance collapsed rapidly. Balliol was stripped of his royal authority and taken into English custody. Edward now believed he had solved the Scottish problem. It is difficult to imagine him realizing that he had instead purchased several decades of trouble. Among the Scottish nobles watching these events was Robert Bruce. Robert was still young. He was not yet the heroic warrior king of later legend. He was a nobleman navigating a dangerous political landscape. And this is one of the most important things to remember about Robert Bruce. He did not begin his career as a simple freedom fighter. He was a medieval aristocrat. His family had interests. His family had lands. His family had a claim to the Scottish throne. And Robert spent years trying to work out how all of those things could coexist with the enormous power of Edward I. Sometimes he resisted Edward. Sometimes he submitted. Sometimes he changed sides. Sometimes he probably wished the entire political situation would simply stop being complicated for 5 minutes. It never did. Then another man appeared. William Wallace. Wallace was not a king. He did not belong to the most powerful royal family. Yet, in 1297 he became one of the leading figures in Scottish resistance. The Scottish victory at Stirling Bridge that year transformed him into a symbol of resistance. The English had expected another campaign. Instead, they encountered a Scottish force that understood the terrain and chose its moment. Stirling Bridge was narrow. The English army had to cross it. And the Scots waited. When enough English troops had crossed to make the situation awkward but not enough to make it safe, the Scots attacked. It was a disaster for the English. And suddenly Scotland had a hero. Wallace. Robert Bruce was also involved in the Scottish resistance, though his political path remained complicated. In 1298, after Wallace's defeat at Falkirk, Bruce became one of the guardians of Scotland alongside his great rival, John Comyn. 2 men. 1 kingdom. 1 throne waiting somewhere in the background. And absolutely no shortage of reasons to distrust each other. The Bruce and the Comyn. John Comyn was powerful. He was connected to the Balliol family, and therefore had a strong interest in the future of the Scottish crown. Robert Bruce wanted the throne for himself. This was not merely a disagreement between 2 politicians. It was a collision between 2 enormous aristocratic networks. The Bruce family and the Comyn family possessed land, influence, followers, and memories. Medieval politics was personal. If your rival gained an advantage, that advantage might mean your cousin lost land. Your ally lost a castle. Your brother lost a position. Your family lost influence. And so political arguments could become deeply emotional. Robert and John Comyn repeatedly disagreed. Eventually, in 1304, Edward I conquered most of Scotland again. Stirling Castle fell after a prolonged siege. The Scottish political leadership was weakened. And Robert Bruce faced a decision. Continue cooperating with Edward, or gamble everything on another attempt to claim the Scottish crown. For a man in his position, either choice was dangerous. Then came the meeting that changed everything. In February 1306, Robert Bruce met John Comyn at Greyfriars Kirk in Dumfries. The precise details are uncertain. Medieval chroniclers naturally enjoyed a dramatic story, and later generations added their own interpretations. But the essential fact is clear. Robert Bruce killed John Comyn inside the church. He had crossed a line from which there was no comfortable return. Killing a political rival was already serious. Killing him in a church made the situation much worse. Robert now faced the English king. He faced the Comyn family. He faced the church. And he had only one obvious path forward: the throne. Because if he did not become king, there was every reason to believe his enemies would eventually destroy him. So Robert Bruce moved quickly. He was crowned King of Scots at Scone on March 25, 1306. The ceremony was hurried. The situation was desperate. And even the coronation itself contained an extraordinary complication. The Stone of Destiny, traditionally associated with Scottish kingship, had been carried away by Edward I years earlier. So Robert was crowned without it. Then, 2 days later, Isabella Macduff, Countess of Buchan, arrived and claimed the traditional right of her family to crown the Scottish king. The ceremony was repeated. Robert was now king. But being crowned king and actually possessing a kingdom are 2 very different things. And Robert was about to discover the difference. The first disaster. The English response was swift. Edward I declared Robert a traitor. The Comyn family sought revenge. And Robert's new reign immediately began collapsing. His forces met the English at Methven in June 1306. The result was a Scottish defeat. Robert escaped. But the situation became worse. Another defeat followed at Dalry. His supporters were scattered. His enemies were closing in. And the royal family was no longer safe. Robert's wife, Elizabeth de Burgh, was captured. His daughter Marjorie was captured. His sisters were captured. His allies were hunted. 3 of his brothers were eventually executed. Robert himself disappeared into the wilderness. This is the point in the story where the legend begins to separate from the human being. Later stories would remember the determined Bruce. The warrior. The king. The spider. But before he became that figure, he was simply a hunted man. He had failed. And he knew it. Somewhere in the Scottish landscape, Robert Bruce had to decide whether the crown was worth dying for. The answer, eventually, was yes. He disappeared into the Western Highlands and Islands. He may have spent time in Ireland. He moved constantly. He relied on small groups of supporters. He avoided large battles. He learned the geography of survival. And this was where Robert Bruce began to change. The old strategy had failed. He could not beat England by behaving like a conventional medieval king. He did not have the resources. He did not have the castles. He did not have the army. So he stopped trying to fight the war on England's terms. He began fighting differently. Small attacks, ambushes, rapid movement, knowledge of the landscape, the destruction of enemy strongholds, the gradual accumulation of victories. It was not glamorous. There were no enormous banners filling the horizon. No grand tournament. No heroic charge accompanied by trumpets. Mostly, there was mud. Rain. Cold. Exhaustion. And men trying not to be found. Which, when you think about it, is a rather more realistic description of medieval warfare than most paintings suggest. The return of the outlaw king. By 1307, Robert Bruce was back. The exact details of his movements are surrounded by tradition, but the broad story is clear. He began rebuilding his support in Scotland. And suddenly the man who had seemed finished was becoming dangerous again. At Loch Troll, Bruce's forces defeated an English contingent. At Loudon Hill, he achieved another important victory. His strategy was beginning to work. He did not need to destroy every English army. He needed to make English control of Scotland increasingly expensive. Every castle that resisted him had to be supplied. Every road needed protection. Every garrison needed soldiers. Every Scottish nobleman who switched sides altered the balance. And gradually, the English position began to weaken. Then, in July 1307, the greatest stroke of luck Robert Bruce could possibly have received arrived from the north. Edward I was coming to Scotland. The old king had spent years trying to crush Scottish resistance. He was determined to finish the job. But he never got there. Edward died near the Scottish border. He was 68 years old. His son became Edward II. And Edward II did not possess his father's determination, political authority, or military effectiveness. This mattered enormously. Robert Bruce now had breathing room. Not peace. Certainly not safety. But breathing room. He used it. Over the next several years, Bruce and his supporters attacked English-held castles across Scotland. He also confronted the Scottish families who had resisted him. The MacDougals of Argyll were among his major enemies. In 1308, Bruce defeated them and tightened his control over the country. The political map began changing. Men who had once opposed him now submitted. Others were stripped of their lands. Castles fell. English garrisons disappeared. And Robert began behaving less like an outlaw and more like a king. By 1309, he was able to hold a parliament at St. Andrews. That was significant. A parliament was not simply a meeting. It was a public demonstration that the king possessed enough authority to gather the political community around him. Robert Bruce had started the decade as a fugitive. Now he was holding parliament. But Edward II had not forgotten Scotland. In 1310, the English king invaded. The invasion achieved little. Bruce avoided a decisive battle. The English army struggled to find him. It moved through Scotland, consuming resources, while Robert's forces remained elusive. And this is one of the quiet lessons of Bruce's story. Winning does not always mean destroying your opponent. Sometimes winning means refusing to give your opponent the battle he wants. The English army was powerful. But power is difficult to use when the enemy will not stand still. By 1314, Robert Bruce controlled most of Scotland. Only a few major English strongholds remained. One of them was Stirling Castle. And Stirling mattered enormously. The castle sat in a strategic position. Whoever controlled Stirling possessed one of the great gateways between northern and southern Scotland. The Scottish forces besieging it reached an agreement with the English governor. If the castle were not relieved by midsummer, it would be surrendered. The deadline was approaching, and Edward II decided to act. He would gather an enormous army. He would march north. He would relieve Stirling. And he would crush Robert Bruce once and for all. Because apparently history had decided that the situation needed one more dramatic escalation. Bannockburn. The English army approached Stirling in June 1314. It was enormous by the standards of medieval Scotland. Knights, mounted soldiers, infantry, archers, camp followers. Thousands of men moving north beneath banners and royal standards. The ground itself was difficult. The area around Bannockburn contained streams, marshy ground, woodland, and uneven terrain. Robert Bruce knew it well. He had been preparing. His army was smaller. But he had something the English army did not. A clear understanding of where the battle needed to happen. The Scottish infantry were organized into schiltrons, dense formations of spearmen, men standing close together, spears pointing outward. A defensive wall of wood and iron. Against cavalry, such a formation could be extremely difficult to break. But medieval warfare was unpredictable. Nothing was guaranteed. On June 23, fighting began. The English vanguard encountered Scottish forces. One of the famous episodes involved Robert Bruce himself. According to later accounts, he faced the English knight Sir Henry de Bohun. The knight charged. Bruce waited. At the last moment, he moved aside and struck him down. The story became legendary. It is also exactly the sort of story that medieval chroniclers loved. A king, a charging knight, a single combat, a dramatic blow. History, unfortunately, is rarely quite that neat. But the story survives because it captures something real about Bruce's character. He was willing to be physically present. He was not a distant king watching the battle from a safe hill. He was in the danger. And his men could see him. That mattered. The fighting continued. The next day would be decisive. On June 24, 1314, the main battle began. The Scottish army moved forward. The schiltrons advanced. The English cavalry attacked. The Scottish formations held. Again and again, the English attempted to break the Scottish lines. And again, the terrain worked against them. The English army became compressed. Movement became difficult. Men had less room. The Scots pressed forward. The English archers were unable to use their advantage as effectively as they might have on more open ground. Then the Scottish camp followers and reserve troops appeared from the rear. From a distance, the English may have believed that another Scottish force was arriving. Panic spread. The English army began to collapse. Thousands of men tried to escape. Some drowned in the Bannockburn. Others were trapped. Others fled south. The Scottish victory was overwhelming. Edward II escaped. Stirling was relieved no longer. The English army that had marched north expecting to destroy Robert Bruce had instead been destroyed itself. Bannockburn did not instantly produce a modern nation-state. It did not make every Englishman leave Scotland the following morning, but it transformed the war. It proved that Edward II could be defeated. It proved that Robert Bruce was not merely surviving. He was winning. And for Scotland, the psychological impact was enormous. A king who had once been hunted through the Highlands had now defeated the army of the English king. The balance had changed. After Bannockburn, there is a temptation to end the story here. It makes a perfect ending. The brave king defeats the invading army. The enemy runs. Scotland is free. Everyone goes home. The credits roll. Unfortunately, medieval history is not especially interested in satisfying endings. Bannockburn was a turning point. But the war continued. Robert Bruce still needed to secure Scotland. He needed recognition. He needed diplomatic support. He needed to make sure his enemies could not simply return. And England was still England. Its resources were enormous. Its political influence remained substantial. So Bruce continued campaigning. Scottish forces raided northern England. Castles were captured. Berwick fell to the Scots in 1318. And Bruce increasingly used military pressure as part of a wider political strategy. The goal was no longer simply survival. It was recognition. The Pope mattered. The papacy mattered. Medieval kingship was deeply connected to the wider Christian political order. If the Pope refused to recognize Bruce, the English could continue presenting him as a rebel. Bruce had been excommunicated after the killing of John Comyn. The Church had its own interests. Edward II attempted to use papal authority against the Scots. And so, after the battlefield victories, Robert Bruce entered another kind of war. A war fought with letters, seals, messengers, Latin, diplomatic arguments, and occasionally enormous amounts of patience, which may actually have been harder than fighting. The Declaration of Arbroath. In 1320, Scottish nobles and political leaders sent a remarkable letter to Pope John XXI. It became known as the Declaration of Arbroath. The document was written in Latin and asked the Pope to recognize Scotland as an independent kingdom and Robert Bruce as its lawful king. It was sealed by 8 earls and around 40 barons. Its language was extraordinary. The declaration did not simply say that Robert was a good king. It argued that Scotland was a nation with its own history. Its people had chosen their king. And if Robert ever abandoned their cause, they claimed that they could replace him. That idea is fascinating, because it places the king inside a relationship with the political community. The king is important, but the kingdom comes first. The document famously declared that the Scots would not accept English lordship and that they were fighting for freedom rather than glory, wealth, or honor. For a medieval political document, that is powerful language. But it is worth being careful. The Declaration of Arbroath was not a modern declaration of universal democracy. Medieval Scotland remained a deeply hierarchical society. Most people did not suddenly become politically equal. But the document did express a powerful concept of national independence. And it helped strengthen the political case Robert Bruce had been building for years. The Pope did not immediately give Bruce everything he wanted. Diplomacy moved slowly. Very slowly. The sort of slowly that makes modern people stare at their phones after waiting 12 seconds for a web page. But eventually circumstances changed. England became increasingly unstable. Edward II's political position weakened. And Robert Bruce continued applying pressure. By the 1320s, the English government was increasingly willing to negotiate. Finally, in 1328, the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton recognized Scottish independence and Robert's position as King of Scots. After decades of war, the central objective had been achieved. Scotland had not been absorbed into England. Robert Bruce was recognized as king, and the kingdom he had fought for was, at last, legally acknowledged as independent. The king after the war. And then comes one of the strangest parts of the story. What does a warrior king do after he has won? Robert Bruce spent the last years of his life trying to secure what he had gained. He had to think about succession. His son David was still young. His daughter Marjorie was part of the royal succession arrangements. The kingdom needed stability. And Robert himself was increasingly unwell. The years had taken their toll. The king who had once crossed mountains as a hunted fugitive was now older. His body was failing. His political achievements were secure enough to survive him, but nothing in medieval Scotland was ever completely secure. Robert Bruce died in 1329. He was about 54 years old. His body was buried at Dunfermline Abbey. But his story did not quite end there. According to tradition, Robert had wanted his heart carried on crusade. Sir James Douglas, one of his closest companions, took responsibility for carrying it. Douglas died fighting in Spain. The heart was returned to Scotland. It was eventually buried at Melrose Abbey. And so Robert Bruce, who had spent his life fighting to secure a kingdom, was divided in death. His body rested at Dunfermline. His heart rested at Melrose. His memory belonged to Scotland. What Robert Bruce actually won. It is easy to turn Robert Bruce into a statue. A man on horseback. Sword raised. Wind blowing through his hair. Scotland stretching dramatically behind him. But statues are convenient because they do not have to make difficult decisions. Robert Bruce did. He changed sides. He made political compromises. He killed a rival. He failed. He lost battles. He abandoned conventional warfare. He ordered harsh actions against his enemies. He negotiated when negotiation was useful. He fought when fighting was necessary. He was not a flawless hero. He was a medieval king. And perhaps that makes his story more interesting. His greatest achievement was not one battle. Not even Bannockburn. His greatest achievement was persistence. He survived long enough for his political strategy to work. He understood that a kingdom could not be won by bravery alone. It required soldiers, food, castles, alliances, money, diplomacy, legitimacy, and time. Lots and lots of time. The Scotland he inherited in 1306 was fractured. The Scotland he left in 1329 was independent. That transformation is the real story. The quiet afterward. And now, centuries later, imagine returning to Scotland at night. The same hills are still there. The wind still moves through the grass. Rain still comes across the landscape. Castles that were once filled with soldiers now stand empty beneath the sky. The roads are different. The borders are different. The languages have changed. The people have changed. But the landscape remembers. At Bannockburn, there is no longer the roar of thousands of men. No horses pounding across the ground. No banners. No cries from soldiers. Just open land. Grass. Wind. The distant sound of modern life. And perhaps that is the strangest thing about history. The people who lived through these events thought they were living in the center of the world. To Robert Bruce, the next battle could mean everything. To a soldier in his army, tomorrow could mean life or death. To a farmer whose field was crossed by an army, history was probably less romantic. It was mud. Broken fences. Missing animals. Fear. Hunger. And then, eventually, silence again. Centuries pass. The armies disappear. The kings disappear. The arguments that once seemed so urgent become paragraphs in books. But the hills remain. Robert Bruce became a legend because he won. But perhaps we remember him even more because, for a while, he looked very much like a man who would lose. That is the part worth lingering on. The crown did not make him powerful. He became king before he had a kingdom. The title did not save him. He had to save himself. The army did not always protect him. Sometimes he had almost no army at all. Victory did not arrive when he first demanded it. It arrived slowly. Through failure. Through patience. Through adaptation. Through years when the easiest thing in the world would have been to give up. And somewhere beneath the mythology is a simple human truth. History is often decided by people who continue after the moment when continuation seems unreasonable. Robert Bruce did that. Again. And again. And again. Until eventually, Scotland was free. So if you are listening to this late at night, perhaps let the story settle for a moment. Think of the young Robert Bruce in Ayrshire. Think of the boy growing up among castles and rival families. Think of the kingdom waiting for a king. Think of Edward I marching north. Think of Wallace at Stirling Bridge. Think of Bruce and Comyn arguing in a church. Think of the crown at Scone. Think of the disastrous months that followed. Think of the hunted king disappearing into the western landscape. And then think of him returning. Slowly. Quietly. One victory at a time. Until the man who had once been nearly forgotten was standing before the English army at Bannockburn. And perhaps, beneath all the banners and armor, he was still that same man. Still uncertain. Still afraid. Still human. Only now, he had learned something important. That history does not always belong to the strongest person in the room. Sometimes it belongs to the person who can wait. Sometimes it belongs to the person who knows the land. Sometimes it belongs to the person who can survive one more winter. And sometimes, very occasionally, it belongs to the person who simply refuses to disappear. Robert the Bruce died in 1329. The medieval world continued without him. Kings came and went. Wars began. Wars ended. Castles changed hands. Generations were born who had never seen his face. But Scotland remained. And somewhere in the darkness, beneath the rain and the wind, the old story remained too. A hunted man. A broken kingdom. A crown without certainty. A battle in the mud. And a country that, after decades of struggle, was still its own. So let the fire burn lower now. Let the rain move softly across the hills. The banners have been folded. The horses are quiet. The soldiers have gone home. The king is sleeping beneath the stones of Dunfermline. And Scotland, for tonight at least, is quiet. Before the crown. There is something strangely peaceful about looking backward through 7 centuries. The people we are about to meet are long gone. Their voices have disappeared. Their footsteps have disappeared. Their arguments, their jokes, their private worries, the things they were embarrassed about, the meals they ate, the clothes they complained about, all of it has dissolved into the enormous silence of time. And yet, for a little while, we can bring them back. Not perfectly. History does not give us that luxury. We cannot know exactly what Robert Bruce was thinking when he was 10 years old, or what he said to his mother when he was frightened, or whether he preferred one horse over another. We can only gather the fragments that survived and try to imagine the world around them. And what a world it was! The Scotland of Robert Bruce's childhood was not empty wilderness. It was a lived-in landscape. Fields had been plowed for generations. Sheep moved across hillsides. Cattle wandered along tracks that would later become roads. Farmers worked beneath the same enormous skies that still hang over Scotland today. There were villages. There were churches. There were markets. There were castles. And there were families. Always the families. Because in medieval Scotland, your family was not merely the people you ate dinner with. Your family was your political identity. Your protection. Your inheritance. Your enemies. Your friends. Sometimes all at once. The Bruce family was one of the most powerful noble families in Scotland. They held lands in both Scotland and England, and their connections stretched across the border. That border, incidentally, was not quite the solid line we imagine today. It was a frontier, but frontiers in medieval Europe could be wonderfully untidy. People crossed them. Nobles owned land on both sides. Merchants traveled through them. Armies crossed them. And when two kingdoms went to war, the people living nearby had the uncomfortable experience of discovering that geography had suddenly become political. Robert Bruce grew up understanding this world. He was born in 1274. His father was Robert Bruce, Lord of Annandale. His mother was Marjorie, Countess of Carrick. And through his mother's family, Robert inherited a connection to Carrick, a region in southwestern Scotland. This was important. Very important. Because Robert was not simply a wealthy young nobleman waiting for his inheritance. He was born into a family with a claim to something much greater. The Scottish throne. His grandfather had already pursued that claim. And this meant that Robert grew up in the shadow of a question that would eventually consume his adult life. Who should be King of Scotland? It sounds like a simple question. It was not. Not even slightly. The problem began with Alexander III. Alexander had been King of Scots since childhood and had ruled for many years. His reign had brought relative stability. Scotland had its internal disputes, of course, because Scotland was populated by human beings and human beings have never been especially good at agreeing about things. But the kingdom was functioning. Then tragedy arrived. Alexander's children died. His son Alexander died young. His daughter Margaret died as well. The king was left with one surviving grandchild. Margaret. She was the daughter of his daughter Margaret and King Eric II of Norway. And she was a child. A very young child. Which meant Scotland's future depended upon a little girl who lived across the sea. For a while, people managed. Margaret was recognized as heir. Arrangements were made for her future. There was even discussion of marrying her to Edward, the son of King Edward I of England. On paper, it might have looked like a clever solution. Two kingdoms could be connected peacefully. A Scottish queen and an English prince. Everyone could remain happy. Everyone could remain independent. The border could become less dangerous. People could get on with their lives. Because, as we all know, medieval political marriages always worked out beautifully. Margaret sailed towards Scotland in 1290. She never arrived. She became sick during the journey and died. She was perhaps 7 years old. And with her death, Scotland suddenly had no obvious monarch. The royal succession collapsed into uncertainty. And into that uncertainty stepped the claimants. One of them was Robert Bruce's grandfather. The other major claimant was John Balliol. The two families had competing claims based upon descent from the Scottish royal family. Neither claim was absurd. Neither claimant could simply be dismissed. And so the Scots turned to the most powerful ruler available to them. Edward I of England. That decision would haunt Scotland for generations. Edward Longshanks. Edward I is one of those historical figures who seems almost designed for a story. He was known as Longshanks because of his height. He had fought wars. He had ruled England with considerable authority. He had conquered Wales. He was experienced, determined, and deeply convinced that kingship meant power. Edward was not the sort of man who entered a negotiation intending to leave with exactly what he had been offered. He wanted something more. He wanted recognition that he was overlord of Scotland. The Scottish nobles had little choice. Their kingdom was divided. The succession was uncertain. And Edward's army was nearby. So they accepted his involvement. Edward listened to the competing claims. He examined genealogies. He consulted legal arguments. And eventually, in 1292, he selected John Balliol. Balliol became King of Scots. Robert Bruce's grandfather lost. But he did not forget. Neither did the Bruce family. And neither did Edward. John Balliol's reign was doomed almost immediately. Edward expected him to obey. Balliol discovered that being king while another king treated you as his subordinate was rather less satisfying than advertised. The Scots resisted. Edward demanded military support. Balliol hesitated. Edward became angry. The relationship deteriorated. Then the Scots made a decision. They would resist Edward. And Edward responded in the language medieval kings understood particularly well. He invaded. In 1296, English forces crossed into Scotland. The first major target was Berwick. Berwick was prosperous. Its location made it strategically important. The attack was brutal. The English army captured the town and killed many of its inhabitants. The exact scale of the slaughter has been debated by historians, but there is no doubt that the attack was devastating. It sent a message. Edward was not coming to negotiate. He was coming to impose his authority. The English army moved north. Scottish resistance collapsed. John Balliol surrendered. His royal authority was stripped away. He was sent into captivity. And Edward believed he had conquered Scotland. He even had the Stone of Destiny removed from Scone and taken south. The ancient stone associated with Scottish kingship was carried to Westminster. The symbolism could hardly have been clearer. Edward was saying, in effect, that Scottish kingship itself was now under English control. But Scotland had not agreed to disappear. And rebellion was already beginning. William Wallace. In 1297, a resistance movement emerged. Its most famous figure was William Wallace. We know surprisingly little about his early life. Later generations surrounded him with legend. Movies made him taller. Poets made him more eloquent. Stories made him almost impossibly heroic. The real Wallace was a military leader who became one of the central symbols of Scottish resistance. And his great moment came at Stirling Bridge. The English army approached. The Scottish forces waited on the northern side of the River Forth. The bridge itself was narrow. The English had numbers. But numbers become awkward when only a small portion of your army can cross at once. The Scots waited. They watched the English begin crossing. More soldiers came. Then more. The Scots waited again. And finally, when enough English soldiers had crossed to create a vulnerable group, the Scottish forces attacked. The battle became a disaster for the English. The bridge trapped their own troops. Scottish soldiers struck from the opposite side. English cavalry found itself fighting in confined space. The Scots won. It was one of the great victories of the Scottish Wars of Independence. And Robert Bruce was watching. He was still young. He was also caught in an uncomfortable position. He belonged to the Scottish nobility. He had reasons to resist Edward. But his family's political interests were complicated. He had not yet become the committed national hero that later generations would imagine. Robert Bruce was still calculating. And perhaps that is worth remembering. History is often taught as though people know in advance what role they are going to play. They do not. Robert did not know he would become King of Scots. Wallace did not know he would become a national legend. Edward did not know that his attempt to conquer Scotland would become one of the great failures of his reign. They were simply living through events. and events kept getting worse. Falkirk. Edward returned to Scotland. In 1298, the English army met the Scots at Falkirk. This time the English were prepared. The Scottish army was defeated. Wallace's political position weakened. He eventually resigned as Guardian of Scotland. Robert Bruce became one of the Guardians. His fellow Guardian was John Comyn. And now two men stood at the center of Scottish politics. Bruce. Comyn. Both powerful. Both ambitious. Both connected to different political networks. Both with reasons to believe they could shape Scotland's future. It was never going to be peaceful. For several years, Scottish resistance continued. Edward captured castles. Scottish nobles changed sides. The Bruce family maneuvered. The Comyn family maneuvered. And all the while, Scotland remained caught between two kingdoms. By 1304, Edward had achieved another major success. Stirling Castle fell. The last major center of Scottish resistance was captured. Edward believed the war was effectively over. But Robert Bruce was not finished. And this is where the story becomes more complicated. Robert had spent years trying to survive within the existing political system. He had cooperated with Edward at times. He had resisted him at others. He had been Guardian of Scotland. He had a royal claim. But he was not yet prepared to stake everything. Then came the meeting with John Comyn. Dumfries. February 1306. Dumfries. Greyfriars Kirk. Two powerful men entered a church. Robert Bruce. John Comyn. They had political disagreements. They had competing claims. They had families with long memories. Something happened. The exact conversation is unknown. Perhaps Robert accused Comyn of betraying him. Perhaps Comyn had threatened to reveal Bruce's plans to Edward. Perhaps both men entered the meeting already expecting confrontation. Whatever the precise details, Robert Bruce stabbed John Comyn. Comyn was wounded. He was taken to the altar. And Bruce's companions returned. Comyn was killed. It was an astonishing act. A murder. A political assassination. And, because it happened in a church, a sacrilege. Robert Bruce had now made enemies of the Comyn family. He had placed himself in opposition to Edward. And he had put himself in conflict with the church. There was no comfortable way backward. If Bruce fled, he might spend the rest of his life hunted. If he submitted, his enemies might destroy him. So he chose the third option. He would become king. Scone. Robert Bruce was crowned at Scone on March 25, 1306. The ceremony was important. But it was also incomplete. The stone of destiny was gone. And the crown itself was not securely his. Still, Robert was king. The ceremony was followed by another ceremony. Isabella Macduff, Countess of Buchan, arrived and insisted that tradition gave her family the right to crown the king. Robert was crowned again. For a brief moment, it must have felt like destiny. A crown. A throne. A kingdom. And then reality arrived. Edward I was furious. The English king declared Robert a traitor. The Scottish political situation collapsed. Robert's enemies moved. The king's forces were defeated at Methven. Then again at Dowry. The dream of kingship seemed to be disappearing almost as quickly as it had arrived. Robert fled. And his family paid the price. Elizabeth de Burgh, his wife, was captured. His daughter Marjorie was captured. His sisters were captured. Isabella Macduff was captured and imprisoned in a cage. Several of Bruce's brothers were executed. Robert himself became a fugitive. The King of Scots had no kingdom. No secure castle. No army large enough to defend him. No certainty that he would survive the year. Imagine that. Imagine being crowned king in March. And by summer, running for your life. That was Robert Bruce's reality. The spider. There is a famous story about Robert Bruce hiding in a cave and watching a spider repeatedly attempt to attach its web. The spider fails. It tries again. Fails again. And eventually succeeds. Robert supposedly takes this as a lesson. Try again. Again. And again. Until you succeed. The story is probably legendary. There is no good contemporary evidence that it happened. But perhaps it survives because it feels true. Not literally true. Emotionally true. Because Bruce's career really did depend upon repeated attempts after failure. The first attempt had failed. The second had failed. He was still alive. That was enough. Bruce disappeared into the Western Highlands. He moved among islands. He relied on supporters. He learned how to fight differently. This was no longer the War of Kings. It was the war of survival. Small groups moved through difficult country. They struck suddenly. They disappeared. They avoided large English forces. They attacked supply lines. They destroyed isolated garrisons. The English had castles. Bruce had mobility. The English had money. Bruce had patience. The English could occupy territory. Bruce could make occupation exhausting. Slowly, the balance began to change. The winter campaigns. The Scottish landscape became Bruce's ally. This is one of the most important aspects of his military success. Scotland is not an easy country to invade. Mountains. Lochs. Forests. Marshes. Narrow valleys. Unpredictable weather. Long distances. An army could march into Scotland and discover that the landscape itself was an enemy. Robert Bruce knew this. His opponents often did not. The English could capture a castle. But a castle did not control every hill, every forest, every road, every village, every narrow pass. Bruce's forces could appear suddenly. They could destroy an isolated position, then disappear again. It was exhausting. And medieval armies depended upon supplies. Men needed food. Horses needed fodder. Weapons needed maintenance. Garrisons needed payment. A war that continued without decisive battles could become enormously expensive. Robert Bruce understood this. And gradually, his enemies began to understand it too. Loudon Hill. One of Bruce's important victories came at Loudon Hill in 1307. The English force was commanded by Aymer de Valence. Bruce knew he was outnumbered. So he prepared the battlefield. He dug trenches. He restricted the ground where English cavalry could maneuver. This was clever. Knights depended heavily upon mobility. A cavalry charge was powerful when horses could build speed and strike a vulnerable formation. If the terrain prevented that, the advantage disappeared. Bruce's men waited. The English attacked. The Scots held. Then they pushed forward. The English were defeated. It was not Bannockburn. Not yet. But it was a sign. Robert Bruce had learned. He was no longer simply reacting to events. He was shaping them. And then, as if history had decided Bruce needed one enormous piece of luck, the English king himself died. Edward I's final march. Edward I was old. He had spent years fighting Scotland. He was determined to finish the campaign. In 1307, he marched north. He was ill. But he continued. His army moved towards Scotland. Robert Bruce knew that if Edward reached him with the full English army, the situation could become extremely dangerous. But Edward never reached him. The king died near Berg by Sands. He was 68. His son, Edward II, became king. And Edward II was very different from his father. He did not possess the same military authority. He was less interested in personally directing campaigns. He faced political problems at home. And suddenly Robert Bruce had something he had desperately needed: time. The new king did not immediately crush the Scottish rebellion. Bruce used the opportunity. He expanded his control. He attacked English positions. He pressured Scottish nobles who remained opposed to him. And one by one, the old political order began collapsing. The Scottish noble families. This part of the story is sometimes skipped because it is less dramatic than sword fights. But it mattered enormously. Robert Bruce could not rule Scotland if half the Scottish nobility opposed him. He had to bring them into his camp. Some came willingly. Some changed sides because the political winds had shifted. Others were defeated. Bruce was not gentle with everyone. The medieval king who wanted independence for Scotland was also perfectly capable of punishing Scottish enemies. This is another reminder that national history can become too simple when we turn it into a morality tale. Bruce was fighting England. But he was also fighting Scots who opposed him. The question was not simply Scotland versus England. It was also Bruce versus his rivals. The Bruce family versus the Comyn family. One political vision versus another. And after years of warfare, Bruce increasingly won. The Comyn influence declined. The Bruce faction expanded. The king's authority became stronger. By the end of the first decade of the 14th century, the man who had once been an outlaw was becoming something much more formidable. A functioning king. A different kind of king. Robert Bruce did not restore Scotland simply by winning battles. He rebuilt administration. He held parliaments. He redistributed lands. He strengthened loyal families. He established authority. He used confiscated estates to reward supporters. He understood something that every successful medieval monarch eventually had to learn. Winning a war is one thing. Governing afterward is another. You cannot spend every morning fighting. At some point, someone has to collect taxes. Someone has to judge disputes. Someone has to maintain roads. Someone has to manage castles. Someone has to make sure the king's orders actually reach the people they are supposed to reach. Robert Bruce was becoming a ruler. And Edward II was struggling. The contrast became increasingly important. The road to Bannockburn. By 1313, Robert Bruce controlled much of Scotland. English power remained. But it was shrinking. Stirling Castle was one of the last major English strongholds. It was strategically important. The Scottish forces surrounded it. The English commander agreed that if the castle was not relieved by midsummer 1314, he would surrender. Edward II had to act. If he allowed Stirling to fall, the political consequences would be enormous. So he gathered an army. A very large army. Medieval chroniclers sometimes gave wildly exaggerated numbers, so we should be cautious. But there is no doubt that the English force was significantly larger than Bruce's. Thousands of soldiers marched north. The English army carried supplies, weapons, banners, armor, horses. The sound must have been extraordinary. Imagine standing somewhere along the road and hearing it approach. First, distant hoofbeats. Then wheels. Then voices. Then the clatter of armor. Then hundreds of horses. Then thousands. A moving wall of medieval warfare. And somewhere ahead, Robert Bruce was waiting. He knew he could not simply meet the English in open ground and hope courage would solve everything. He needed terrain. He needed discipline. He needed timing. And most of all, he needed his men to believe they could win. The first day. The Battle of Bannockburn began on June 23, 1314. The Scottish army occupied ground south of Stirling. Bruce positioned his forces carefully. The English approached. And then something happened that would become part of the legend. Robert Bruce encountered an English knight named Henry de Bohun. Bohun was mounted. Bruce was also mounted. According to later accounts, Bohun charged. Bruce waited. At the last moment, he turned. His weapon struck Bohun. The knight fell. Bruce's horse was reportedly almost injured by the force of the encounter. The story says his nobles criticized him afterward for risking the king's life. Bruce supposedly replied that he regretted losing a good axe. It is a wonderfully Bruce-like story. Possibly too wonderfully Bruce-like. Medieval history loves clever one-liners. But whether the exact words were spoken or not, the episode became symbolic. The king had faced danger personally. His men had seen him. And the battle continued. Night at Bannockburn. The first day's fighting did not settle the war. That night, the armies remained near each other. Think about that night. Thousands of men lying in darkness. Fires glowing across the fields. Wounded soldiers groaning. Horses restless. Officers moving through the camps. Priests praying. Men sharpening weapons. Some soldiers trying to sleep. Others staring into the darkness. Tomorrow would decide everything. For the Scottish soldiers, there was nowhere else to go. They were defending their country. For the English soldiers, the objective was straightforward. Relieve Stirling. Defeat Bruce. End the rebellion. Two armies. Two versions of the future. And between them, a landscape of grass, mud, streams, and trees. The moon moved overhead. The fires burned lower. Eventually, morning came. June 24th. The second day of Bannockburn was decisive. The Scottish schiltrons advanced. Spears pointed outward. Men moved together. The formation was difficult to break. English cavalry attacked. But the Scots held. The English army had numbers. Yet numbers became a problem. Too many men. Too little room. The terrain compressed the army. The Scottish formations continued forward. The English archers could have caused enormous damage if they had been able to fire freely. But they struggled to find the necessary space. Eventually, Scottish forces attacked them. The English army began to lose cohesion. And once a medieval army started to panic, recovering order could be almost impossible. Men ran. Horses became frightened. Units became separated. The roads south became crowded. Thousands attempted to escape. Some crossed the Bannockburn. Others were trapped. The Scottish victory was complete. Edward II fled. Stirling Castle was no longer going to be relieved. Robert Bruce had won. Not because his army was larger. It wasn't. Not because Scotland possessed greater resources. It didn't. He won because he understood the battlefield. He had chosen the ground. He had trained his army. He had learned from previous defeats. And he had created a force capable of moving and fighting as a disciplined whole. Bannockburn became the great symbol of Scottish resistance. But Bruce still had work to do. The years after Bannockburn. Victory did not magically erase England from Scotland. There were still English-held castles. Still political opponents. Still diplomatic problems. Still war. Bruce understood that Bannockburn gave him an opportunity. He had to use it. Scottish forces began raiding northern England. This was partly revenge. But it was also strategy. If England could be pressured on its own territory, Edward II would face political problems. The war would become harder to justify. English nobles would ask why their lands were being attacked. Money would disappear. Political pressure would grow. Robert Bruce was turning defense into offense. This was a major change. For years, Scotland had been trying to survive English invasion. Now Scotland was capable of invading England. And that changed the psychological balance. The kingdom that had once been on the defensive was now knocking on England's door. The Battle of Bannockburn. In 1319, Scottish forces invaded northern England. The English attempted to respond. The result was another Scottish victory at Bannockburn. The war continued. And it became increasingly difficult for Edward II to maintain his position. He had political enemies at home. His relationship with the English nobility was unstable. Military campaigns had failed. Scotland remained unconquered. And Robert Bruce was becoming increasingly difficult to defeat. This is when diplomacy began to matter more. Both sides needed peace. But neither side wanted to admit that they needed peace. That is another ancient political tradition. The Pope. There was another problem. The papacy. The Pope had his own political interests. The English king wanted papal support against Bruce. The Scots wanted recognition. Robert Bruce had been excommunicated after the killing of John Comyn. His kingdom was still viewed by many outside Scotland as politically illegitimate. This meant that military victories were not enough. Robert needed legitimacy. He needed the wider European political world to accept that Scotland was a kingdom, and that he was its king. So Scotland sent letters. And one of the most famous was written in 1320. The Declaration of Arbroath. It was addressed to Pope John XXI. The document argued that Scotland had ancient roots and a right to independence. But there was something particularly striking about the way it described Robert Bruce. The letter praised him as the man who had freed Scotland. But it also made an important argument. The Scots said that if Bruce ever abandoned their cause, they would find another king. The implication was remarkable. The king existed for the kingdom. The kingdom did not exist merely for the king. It was not democracy in the modern sense. Medieval Scotland remained hierarchical. But the political idea was powerful. Scotland's independence was more important than the individual monarch. And that helped create something larger than Robert Bruce himself. A national political identity. The long road to peace. The 1320s were a period of gradual change. Robert Bruce was now older. His health was not what it had been. But his political position was stronger than ever. Edward II was increasingly troubled. England was facing internal divisions. The English crown needed stability. The Scots continued their military pressure. Eventually, negotiations became unavoidable. In 1328, the Treaty of Edinburgh and Northampton recognized Scottish independence. Edward III, who had by then become King of England, accepted Robert Bruce as King of Scots. The Long War was effectively over. For Robert Bruce, it must have been an extraordinary moment. 30 years earlier, Edward I had invaded Scotland. The Scottish king had been removed. The stone of destiny had been taken. Wallace had risen and fallen. Bruce had killed John Comyn. Bruce had been crowned. Bruce had been defeated. Bruce had run for his life. His family had been imprisoned. His brothers had died. He had fought through the Highlands. He had rebuilt an army. He had won Bannockburn. And now England formally recognized the independence of Scotland. It had taken decades. But the goal had been achieved. A king without a war. Peace can be surprisingly difficult for people who have spent their lives fighting. Robert Bruce had spent years organizing resistance. Now he had to govern. He had to prepare for succession. His son David was still young. The kingdom needed stability. And Robert's health was deteriorating. He had suffered years of physical hardship. Campaigning had been exhausting. The medieval king's life was not comfortable even when he was winning. There were no quiet retirement homes waiting at the end. No comfortable pension. No afternoon golf. There was administration, church politics, family politics, diplomacy, and the constant possibility that another enemy might appear. Robert Bruce continued working. But he knew his time was limited. He wanted his son to inherit securely. He wanted the independence he had fought for to survive him. And he wanted one final thing: to go on crusade. The crusading dream had remained powerful throughout medieval Europe. Robert had not been able to fulfill it during the years of Scottish War. But as his health declined, the idea returned. According to later tradition, he asked that his heart be carried on crusade after his death. His close companion James Douglas agreed. Douglas would carry it. And that story would become one of the most romantic episodes in Scottish history. But first, Robert Bruce had to die. The last days. In the summer of 1329, Robert Bruce was at Cardross. He was ill. The man who had once moved through the Highlands at night was now confined by his own body. He was about 54. Not old by modern standards. But medieval life was hard. Disease was everywhere. Medicine was limited. And the years of war had left their mark. The king died on June 7, 1329. He had ruled Scotland for 23 years. His body was carried to Dunfermline Abbey. There, beneath the stone architecture of the medieval church, the king was buried. But his heart was another matter. James Douglas took it. He intended to carry it toward the Holy Land. Instead, he traveled to Spain, where he joined a Christian army fighting the Moors. Douglas was killed in battle. According to the tradition, he had carried the king's heart with him. The heart was recovered. It was brought back to Scotland, and eventually buried at Melrose Abbey. Whether every detail of the story happened exactly as later generations remembered is difficult to prove. But the symbolism is irresistible. Robert Bruce's heart, carried by his closest companion, traveled beyond Scotland. The warrior king who had spent his life fighting for one country became part of a story much larger than his own battlefield victories. His body rested at Dunfermline, his heart at Melrose, and his name belonged to Scotland, the son who inherited a kingdom. Robert Bruce's death did not mean Scotland's problems were over. His son David became King David too. He was still a child. And whenever a medieval king died leaving a child on the throne, everyone immediately became interested in politics. Very interested. Edward III had recognized Scottish independence. But political agreements could change. And there were Scottish nobles who had lost lands during Bruce's reign. These men became known as the disinherited. They had grievances. They had ambitions. And they had English support. The peace created by Robert Bruce was fragile. But that does not diminish his achievement. He had created a political structure capable of surviving him. That matters. A great leader who achieves something only while alive has achieved less than one whose work continues afterward. Robert's Scotland was not perfect. It was still a medieval kingdom. There was poverty. There was inequality. There were political disputes. There would be more wars. But Scotland remained politically distinct. And the memory of Bruce became part of the foundation upon which later Scottish identity was built. The man behind the legend. Centuries passed. Robert Bruce became larger. The real man slowly disappeared behind the symbol. Paintings showed him heroic. Statues showed him stern. Poems made him noble. Stories made him wise. The spider became famous. Bannockburn became sacred. And the phrase, Bruce, became almost synonymous with Scottish resistance. But perhaps the real Robert Bruce is more interesting. He was ambitious. He was politically flexible. He could be ruthless. He made enormous mistakes. He killed a rival. He lost battles. He spent years running. He was not born knowing how to defeat England. He learned. He adapted. He survived. That may be the most useful way to understand him. Not as an invincible hero, but as a man who became capable of victory because failure taught him how to change. His first military campaigns were disastrous. Later, he became one of the most effective commanders in medieval Britain. His political position was initially unstable. Later, he became king of a recognized independent kingdom. His family had once competed unsuccessfully for the throne. He eventually secured it. The transformation is astonishing. And yet it happened slowly. One decision at a time. Scotland in the rain. There is another way to think about Robert Bruce. Not through battles. Not through kings. Through landscapes. Imagine the Western Highlands at night. A small group of men moves through the darkness. Their clothing is wet. Their boots are muddy. They speak quietly. The wind is strong. Somewhere behind them, an English patrol is searching. They stop. Listen. Nothing. Then they continue. That may have been Robert Bruce's life for weeks. Perhaps months. We tend to remember the great battlefield. But kingdoms are often won in the quiet spaces between battles. A messenger reaching a village. A nobleman deciding to change sides. A castle opening its gates. A small group of soldiers ambushing another. A farmer providing food. A boat crossing a loch at night. A letter being carried across Europe. A priest reading a political document. History is made from countless small actions. Bannockburn was only possible because of everything that came before it. The hiding. The losses. The alliances. The training. The victories. The failures. The patience. And that is why the story of Robert Bruce is not really the story of one battle. It is the story of accumulation. The meaning of freedom. Robert Bruce did not invent Scottish identity. Scotland existed long before him. Nor did he single-handedly free every person who lived within the kingdom. The medieval political order was far more complicated than that. But he helped preserve something important. Political independence. The ability of Scotland to remain a separate kingdom. The ability of its rulers to govern without accepting English overlordship. And the ability of Scottish political leaders to imagine their kingdom as something worth defending. That last part may be the most important. A country survives not only through armies. It survives through belief. People have to believe that the political community is worth protecting. They have to believe that it has a past. That it has a future. That losing it would mean losing something valuable. Robert Bruce became one of the people who embodied that belief. He was not the whole story. But he became one of its central characters. The empty castle. And now, centuries later, imagine walking through one of Scotland's old castles. The walls are broken. The windows are empty. Grass grows between the stones. Rainwater gathers in cracks. Birds nest where soldiers once slept. The castle may have been fought over by people who believed it was the most important place in the world. Now it is quiet. That is one of the strange gifts of history. It shows us how temporary urgency can be. The people of 1314 thought Bannockburn was everything. And for them, it probably was. But 700 years later, the battlefield is quiet. The banners are gone. The armor is gone. The horses are gone. The dead are gone. Only the landscape remains. And perhaps that is why history is worth remembering. Not because we should live forever in the past, but because the past reminds us that every present moment eventually becomes history too. The things that feel enormous tonight may be forgotten. The things that seem impossible may change. The people who appear defeated may return. The people who seem powerful may disappear. Robert Bruce's life contains all of those reversals. He began with privilege. He entered uncertainty. He became king. He lost almost everything. He became a fugitive. He returned. He won. And finally, after years of struggle, he achieved the thing he had spent his life chasing: independence. A final walk through medieval Scotland. So let us slow the story down now. Imagine the year is 1329. Robert Bruce is gone. The great battles are over. For the moment, Scotland is at peace. The fields are green. The rivers move quietly. The hills remain exactly where they were. Farmers wake early. Shepherds take animals out onto the slopes. Children run through villages. Bells ring from churches. Ships move along the coast. Merchants travel. People complain about taxes. People fall in love. People argue. People grow old. Life continues. This is another thing that great historical stories sometimes hide. For every king, there were thousands of ordinary people who simply had to live. They planted crops during wars. They rebuilt houses. They raised children. They lost relatives. They heard rumors. They watched armies pass. They survived. Robert Bruce's story belongs to them too. Because independence is not an abstract word when your village has been occupied. It is not abstract when soldiers arrive. It is not abstract when taxes are imposed by a foreign power. It is not abstract when your political leaders are taken prisoner. For ordinary people, political freedom can appear in very practical forms. Who makes the laws? Who collects the taxes? Who commands the soldiers? Who decides what kingdom you belong to? Who has the right to call himself your king? These questions mattered. And they mattered for generations. The last image. There is one final image worth keeping. Not Bannockburn. Not the crown. Not the sword. Not the spider. Instead, imagine Robert Bruce near the end of his life. The fighting is over. The kingdom has been recognized. He knows his body is failing. Outside, perhaps, there is rain. Inside, the room is quiet. A fire burns. The king who once had nowhere to sleep now has a kingdom. The man who once ran from English soldiers is now remembered as the king who defeated them. And yet, in the end, he is still simply a human being. He cannot command death to wait. He cannot order time to stop. He cannot make his body young again. The crown cannot save him. The army cannot save him. The castles cannot save him. Eventually, every king reaches the same place. The same silence. The same darkness. The same earth. And perhaps that is the most peaceful way to end the story. Not with triumph, but with quiet. Because Robert Bruce's life was full of noise. Battles. Arguments. Horses. Swords. Church bells. Political speeches. Marching armies. Shouting men. And after all of it, silence. The hills remain. The rain falls. The rivers continue moving toward the sea. The old castles stand beneath the clouds. And Scotland remains. The man is gone. The kingdom remains. The story remains. So tonight, if you are listening in the darkness, let the story drift away now. Let Bannockburn become distant. Let the banners disappear into the mist. Let the soldiers return home. Let the castles grow quiet. Let the old king rest beneath the stones. And imagine the wind crossing the Scottish hills one last time. Slowly. Softly. Unhurried. The same wind that crossed those hills when Robert Bruce was young. The same wind that moved across Bannockburn. The same wind that passed over the fields after the armies were gone. 700 years later, it still moves. And perhaps that is the final lesson. Kings disappear. Wars disappear. Borders change. Names fade. But the landscape keeps breathing. The rain keeps falling. The hills keep waiting. And somewhere in that enormous silence, the memory of a man who once refused to give up still remains. Robert the Bruce. King of Scots. The fugitive who became a king. The defeated man who learned to win. And the ruler whose greatest victory was not simply defeating an army, but leaving behind a Scotland that could continue without him. Now the fires are low. The roads are empty. The castle gates are closed. The horses are sleeping. The king is gone. And Scotland is quiet. Good night. The kingdom before the king. Before we return to Robert Bruce, it is worth slowing down even further. Because there is a danger in telling the story of a famous king. The danger is that the king begins to appear inevitable. As though history had already decided what he would become. As though the boy born in 1274 was simply waiting patiently for the crown. But there was nothing inevitable about Robert Bruce becoming King of Scots. He could have disappeared into the long list of medieval aristocrats whose names survive only because historians occasionally have to mention them. He could have remained a powerful landowner. He could have supported another claimant. He could have spent his life balancing Scottish and English interests. He could have died in a minor feud, leaving behind a respectable family and a few legal documents. Instead, he became one of the central figures in Scottish history. To understand why, we need to spend some more time in the world that produced him. So imagine Scotland in the late 13th century. It is evening. The sun has disappeared behind the hills. There is mist lying low across the fields. The last light is fading from the western sky. A church bell sounds somewhere in the distance. There are no streetlights. No engines. No electrical hum. The darkness is almost complete. A person walking along a country road would know the landscape by memory. A bend in the path. A stream. A stone wall. A hill. A cluster of trees. Perhaps a village ahead. Perhaps a castle. The castle would be one of the most important sights in the landscape. It was not simply a residence. A castle was a statement. It said that someone controlled this place. Someone had money. Someone had soldiers. Someone expected to be obeyed. The Bruce family possessed such places. Their wealth came from land. And land meant power. A medieval nobleman's wealth was not stored in a bank account. It was fields, forests, fisheries, mills, tenants, cattle, castles, rights, privileges, and connections. The larger the estate, the more people depended upon its lord. That gave the lord influence. But it also created obligations. A nobleman was expected to protect his lands. He was expected to maintain his household. He was expected to provide military service. He was expected to support allies. He was expected to marry strategically. And above all, he was expected to preserve the family inheritance. This last responsibility mattered enormously to Robert Bruce, because the Bruce family had been thinking about the Scottish throne for generations. The Bruce claim. Robert's grandfather had been a serious claimant to the Scottish crown. His claim came through his grandmother, Isabel, who was descended from King David I of Scotland. John Balliol's claim came through his own descent from David I. The difference was based on competing interpretations of inheritance. The dispute eventually reached Edward I. Edward was asked to arbitrate. But the moment he accepted the role, he gained enormous leverage. He could present himself as the superior authority whose judgment was necessary. The Scottish nobles had little choice. They needed an answer. The kingdom could not remain indefinitely without a king. And so Edward became the judge. The great irony is that by accepting his arbitration, the Scots gave Edward an opportunity to establish a claim over Scotland itself. This is one of those moments in history where everyone involved probably believed they were making a temporary compromise. Temporary compromises have a habit of becoming permanent problems. Edward eventually selected John Balliol. The Bruce family had lost. But the defeat was not complete. Robert Bruce's grandfather continued to hold enormous power. The family still possessed land, still possessed influence, still possessed its royal claim. And the young Robert Bruce grew up inside that atmosphere. He would have understood from childhood that kingship was not a fairy tale. It was inheritance, politics, law, military power, and family ambition. Languages of a medieval noble. Robert Bruce lived in a multilingual world. The aristocracy of Britain in this period did not speak only one language. English, French, Gaelic, Latin, and Scots existed in overlapping circles. French was particularly important among the aristocracy. Latin dominated written administration and the church. Gaelic remained central in much of Scotland. English was increasingly important in political and commercial life. This meant that a powerful nobleman needed to move between different cultural worlds. Robert's family had connections on both sides of the border. He was not culturally isolated from England. Quite the opposite. The Bruce family had deep English connections. This becomes important because later generations sometimes imagine the conflict as though Robert Bruce had been born into an entirely separate Scottish world, surrounded by English enemies from childhood. Reality was much messier. The aristocracy crossed borders. Families married across them. Landowners owned property in both kingdoms. The same nobleman might owe obligations to both Scottish and English rulers. And this helps explain why Robert's early political behavior could seem inconsistent. He was not necessarily betraying one national identity in favor of another. The modern concept of nationality did not operate in quite the same way. He was navigating a world where loyalty was layered. Family, land, lord, king, church, and increasingly kingdom. Robert Bruce would eventually become a symbol of Scottish independence. But he grew up in a political culture where those boundaries were much less clear. Childhood. We know relatively little about Robert's childhood. This is frustrating. History is very good at recording kings when they become important. It is much less interested in them when they are children. There are no surviving diary entries from young Robert Bruce saying that he had a difficult mathematics lesson that morning. There is no medieval equivalent of a school report. No teacher wrote, "Robert is intelligent but occasionally distracts the other boys by discussing hereditary claims to the Scottish throne." Unfortunately, that would have been useful. Instead, we have fragments. We know where his family held land. We know who his parents were. We know the political world surrounding him. We know that he eventually became a major landowner. And we can reasonably assume that he was trained in the skills expected of a nobleman. Riding, hunting, weapons, religion, languages, law, politics. He would have learned how estates were managed. He would have seen how his father interacted with other nobles. He would have watched marriages arranged for political reasons. He would have learned that a promise between noble families could be almost as important as an army. And he would have learned something else. That the crown was never far away. The death of Alexander III. Then came the event that changed everything. Alexander III died in 1286. He had been riding in bad weather toward Kinghorn in Fife. The king fell from his horse. He died. Suddenly Scotland had lost its monarch. The heir was his granddaughter Margaret of Norway. A child. And the political world immediately became uncertain. The Scottish nobles had to govern during the minority. Guardians were appointed. Different factions emerged. Everyone waited for Margaret. And then, in 1290, she died while traveling toward Scotland. The succession crisis became a catastrophe. The throne was empty. The great families began calculating their chances. The Bruce family had a claim. The Balliols had a claim. And now the question was no longer theoretical. Who would rule Scotland? This was the moment when Edward I entered. And once Edward entered, Scotland's internal dispute became an international crisis. The arbitration. Edward demanded recognition of his overlordship before he would judge the claims. The Scottish nobles accepted. It is easy, from centuries later, to look at this decision and say they should have known better. But they were trapped. They needed a king. Edward was powerful. The alternative was continued uncertainty. So they agreed. Edward examined the claims. The process lasted months. Genealogies were produced. Arguments were made. Legal precedents were discussed. The great men of Scotland waited. Robert Bruce's grandfather was one of the leading claimants. John Balliol was another. Eventually Edward chose Balliol. The Bruce family lost. But the larger disaster had only begun. Because Edward did not intend to treat Balliol as an equal king. He expected him to obey. Balliol's position became humiliating. Every disagreement between the kings strengthened the resentment. The Scottish nobles became increasingly hostile toward Edward. And eventually, Scotland resisted. Berwick. When Edward invaded Scotland in 1296, Berwick became the first great target. The town was wealthy. Its position on the border made it strategically important. Edward attacked. The town fell. Many inhabitants were killed. The event became one of the darkest episodes of the war. The English army then moved north. The Scottish political system collapsed. John Balliol surrendered. His crown was taken from him. He was sent away. Edward now appeared to control Scotland. But conquest on parchment is one thing. Conquest in the landscape is another. Edward could capture castles. He could appoint officials. He could demand obedience. But Scotland was still filled with people who had reasons to resist. And resistance emerged quickly. Robert Bruce watches. Robert Bruce was in an unusual position. His family had lost the succession. But he himself had not yet committed fully to rebellion. This is important. The young Robert did not immediately become the legendary defender of Scottish independence. His choices were shaped by family interests. His father still possessed lands in England. Robert himself had interests there. Edward's power was enormous. An open rebellion could destroy everything. So Robert moved cautiously. He was not alone. Many Scottish nobles were doing the same. They were trying to determine whether resistance could succeed. And in 1297, Wallace's victory at Stirling Bridge changed the calculation. Suddenly England did not look invincible. The Scots had won. The English army had been defeated. Wallace became a national leader. Robert Bruce's political possibilities changed. But he still hesitated. He eventually joined the Scottish resistance. Yet his relationship with the other leaders remained complicated. Wallace and Bruce. It is tempting to imagine Wallace and Bruce as natural allies. In reality, their positions were not identical. Wallace was an outsider to the highest levels of royal succession politics. Bruce was deeply embedded in them. Wallace's authority came from military leadership and popular resistance. Bruce's authority came from family, land, and his claim to the throne. They needed one another. But they also represented different visions of political leadership. After Falkirk in 1298, Wallace's position weakened. Bruce became guardian alongside John Comyn. The two men had competing interests, and the kingdom's political divisions remained unresolved. For years, Scotland's resistance continued. But the English pressure was enormous. Edward I had more resources, more soldiers, more money, more administrative capacity. He could lose an army and build another. Scotland could not do that indefinitely. Eventually, Edward conquered most of the kingdom. Stirling Castle fell in 1304. Scottish resistance seemed broken. Robert Bruce now faced the decision that would define his life. The choice. There were several possible futures. Robert could submit to Edward. He could remain a powerful nobleman. He could protect his family lands. He could live a relatively safe life. Or he could claim the crown. But claiming the crown meant confronting Edward. It meant confronting the Comyns. It meant confronting the church. It meant risking his family. It meant risking his life. There was no guarantee of success. In fact, the odds were terrible. And yet Robert chose the dangerous path. The meeting with John Comyn at Greyfriars Kirk became the point of no return. Whatever exactly happened in that church, Robert emerged from it committed to kingship. There would be no safe middle ground anymore. The coronation. The journey to Scone must have been extraordinary. Robert had supporters. But he did not have the secure control of the kingdom that a king would normally expect. The coronation was held quickly. The stone of destiny was absent. The English had taken it. Yet the ceremony went ahead. Robert was crowned. For a moment, he had achieved what his grandfather had failed to achieve. A Bruce sat on the Scottish throne. But the crown was surrounded by danger. Edward was coming. The Comyn family was hostile. Many Scottish nobles were uncertain. Robert's army was inexperienced. And the king himself had little time to prepare. The first battle came quickly. Methven. The English forces struck Bruce's army while it was vulnerable. The Scots were defeated. Robert escaped. His army was scattered. Then came Dalry. Another defeat. The new king was collapsing. The royal dream seemed to be ending. The price of kingship. Robert's family suffered enormously. His wife Elizabeth was captured. His daughter Marjorie was captured. His sisters were captured. Isabella Macduff, who had crowned him, was captured. His brothers were executed. The English authorities wanted to demonstrate what happened to people who challenged Edward. The message was brutal. The king himself had escaped. His family had not. Robert was now almost alone. And this is where the story becomes less like a royal chronicle and more like a survival story. He could not return openly. He could not raise a conventional army. He could not hold a castle. He had to disappear. So he went west. Into the highlands. Toward the islands. Toward landscapes where large armies struggled to operate. The king became a fugitive. The hidden king. The medieval highlands could be unforgiving. Rain. Cold. Rock. Bog. Long distances. Sudden storms. A small group could survive if it knew the country. A large army could become exhausted. Bruce began to learn how to use that advantage. His supporters gathered around him. Some were loyal because they believed in his cause. Some were loyal because they had no better option. Some were loyal because they hated the English. Some were loyal because they were tied to Bruce by family. Medieval armies were not modern professional forces. They were networks of people. The king needed to persuade nobles to bring men. He needed food. He needed horses. He needed intelligence. He needed places to shelter. He needed ships. He needed messengers. And he needed people willing to risk their lives for him. Slowly, that network began forming. The Western Isles. The western coast of Scotland is a world of water. Lochs. Islands. Narrow channels. Rocky shores. A traveler who knew the sea could disappear quickly. A large army could not. Bruce's movements through this region helped keep him alive. The English could not easily predict where he would appear. And then, gradually, Robert stopped running. He began attacking. Small English forces were ambushed. Garrisons were isolated. Supplies were destroyed. Castles were attacked. The balance began to shift. Robert was learning. Every defeat taught him. Every victory gave him confidence. He discovered what his army could do. He discovered what English armies struggled to do. He began choosing battles rather than accepting them. That difference would eventually decide Bannockburn. Loudon Hill again. By 1307, Robert Bruce had become dangerous. At Loudon Hill, he faced an English army commanded by Aymer de Valence. The English had cavalry. Bruce had fewer men. So Bruce prepared the ground. He dug trenches. He narrowed the battlefield. He forced the English cavalry into a restricted space. The English attacked. The Scottish infantry held. And then the Scots advanced. The English were defeated. This was not a huge battle compared with Bannockburn. But psychologically it mattered. Robert had proved that he could defeat an English army deliberately. Not by luck. Not by surprise alone. By planning. That changed his reputation. And then Edward I died. The old king's death. Edward I had spent much of his later life fighting Scotland. He had been determined. He had been relentless. He had earned a reputation among the Scots that lasted centuries. But in 1307, his health failed. He died while campaigning north. His son Edward II inherited the crown. The difference was immediate. Edward II was not his father. He had other concerns. His relationship with powerful English nobles was unstable. His political authority was weaker. And his military leadership was inconsistent. Robert Bruce now had the opportunity he needed. He began consolidating Scotland. One region at a time. One castle at a time. One political alliance at a time. The king who had once been hiding in the hills now traveled openly. The fugitive was becoming a monarch again. The siege of Stirling. Stirling Castle remained. It was one of the most important fortresses in Scotland. Control of Stirling meant control of the route between the Highlands and Lowlands. The Scottish forces surrounded it. Edward's commander agreed to surrender if the castle was not relieved by midsummer. This created a deadline. Edward II had to act. The English king gathered an army. The army moved north. And Robert Bruce knew what was coming. He had a choice. He could retreat. He could avoid the English. He could continue guerrilla warfare. But Stirling mattered. If he allowed the English to relieve it, his position might weaken. If he defeated the English army, the war could change permanently. So Robert decided to fight. Bannockburn before the battle. The Scottish army assembled near Stirling. The men would have been exhausted. Some had traveled long distances. They carried spears, axes, swords, shields. They wore whatever armor they could afford. Not everyone was heavily armored. Many Scottish soldiers were ordinary men called to military service. They were farmers, laborers, retainers, men from noble households. They knew what was at stake. If the English won, Stirling would be relieved. Bruce's authority might collapse. If the Scots won, England's army would be shattered. The entire political situation could change. So the men waited. The English approached. The sound of their army grew louder. And somewhere in the Scottish camp, Robert Bruce was making his final preparations. He had learned the hard way. Never fight where the enemy is strongest. Make the enemy come where you want them. Make the ground part of your army. Make discipline more important than numbers. And make your soldiers believe that they belong together. That was the army Bruce had created. Now he would see whether it worked. The battle begins. The first fighting began on June 23rd. English troops encountered Scottish forces. The terrain immediately became important. Streams crossed the area. The ground was uneven. There were woods. There were marshy sections. And there were pits prepared by the Scots to disrupt cavalry. The English could not simply charge freely. One of the great strengths of medieval knights was mobility. A mounted knight was powerful. A group of mounted knights could be terrifying. But a horse cannot charge effectively through broken ground. The Scots understood that. Bruce's army was not simply waiting. It was shaping the battlefield. And then came the famous encounter between Bruce and Henry de Bohun. Bohun charged. Bruce waited. At the last moment, Bruce moved aside. His weapon struck. Bohun fell. The Scottish king survived. The story spread through the army. And sometimes a small event becomes larger than itself. The soldiers had seen their king take a personal risk. They had seen him survive. They had seen an English knight fall. Confidence matters. Especially before a battle. The night before everything changed. That night, the two armies remained near each other. The Scottish camp was tense. Men talked quietly. Weapons were checked. Armor was repaired. Food was eaten. Prayers were said. Some men probably laughed. Some probably argued. Some probably sat alone. Every army contains all kinds of people. The brave. The frightened. The confident. The exhausted. The men who desperately want to survive. The men who are trying not to think about tomorrow. Perhaps some Scottish soldier lay beneath the stars and wondered whether he would see his family again. Perhaps an English soldier did exactly the same thing. History tends to separate people into sides. But fear does not care about political allegiance. A frightened English soldier and a frightened Scottish soldier were not emotionally so different. Both were waiting for morning. And morning came. The second day. The Scottish army formed its schiltrons. Long spears pointed outward. The men stood close together. The formation moved as one. The English cavalry attacked. The Scots held. Another attack. The Scots held. The English tried to maneuver. The terrain prevented them from gaining the space they needed. Then Scottish forces advanced. The English army became compressed. The men behind could not easily see what was happening at the front. Orders became difficult to communicate. The battlefield became chaos. And then the English archers were attacked. The archers were one of the English army's major advantages. If they could stand at a distance and fire into the Scottish formations, they could cause enormous casualties. But they were unable to operate freely. Scottish forces moved against them. The English army began to lose cohesion. Then came panic. Once one group began retreating, another followed. The roads became crowded. Men tried to escape. Some horses panicked. The Scottish army pressed forward. The English king fled. Stirling was not relieved. The English army was defeated. And Scotland had won the battle that would define Robert Bruce's reign. The silence after Bannockburn. The morning after the battle must have been strangely quiet. Battlefields always become quiet eventually. The shouting stops. The weapons stop. The horses are exhausted. The wounded need attention. The dead remain. The survivors search for friends. The victorious army counts what it has won. The defeated army tries to disappear. For Robert Bruce, the victory was enormous. But there was no modern news network announcing it across Europe. There was no television. No radio. No internet. News traveled by horse. By ship. By messenger. By rumor. A story would begin in Scotland and gradually move south. The English army had been defeated. The king had escaped. Stirling had not been relieved. Bruce had won. And the political consequences would spread slowly. But they would spread. The war changes shape. After Bannockburn, Robert Bruce no longer needed to prove that England could be defeated. Now he needed to force England to accept reality. Scottish forces began attacking English territory. Northern England became vulnerable. The war moved south. This was a deliberate strategy. Edward II had to feel the cost. The English king could not simply wait for Scotland to disappear. Every Scottish raid damaged his prestige. Every English defeat weakened him politically. Robert Bruce understood that the battlefield victory had created leverage. He intended to use it. The war continued for years. But the direction had changed. Scotland was no longer simply defending itself. Scotland was demanding recognition. Letters instead of swords. Eventually, swords began giving way to letters. The Declaration of Arbroath was written in 1320. Its writers appealed to the Pope. They described Scotland's history. They defended its independence. They defended Robert Bruce. But they also made the kingdom itself central. The document was not merely a royal propaganda piece. It was a statement from the political community of Scotland. The message was clear. Scotland had its own identity, its own history, its own right to exist. Robert Bruce's military victories had created the possibility of independence. The Declaration helped articulate the political argument. And eventually, diplomacy succeeded. The treaty. By 1328, England was ready for peace. The Treaty of Edinburgh and Northampton recognized Scotland's independence. Robert Bruce was recognized as King of Scots. His son David was recognized as heir. The long struggle had ended. Robert had achieved what had once seemed impossible. And perhaps the strangest thing about victory is how ordinary it can feel once it finally arrives. There is no cosmic trumpet. No voice from the heavens. The treaty is signed. Messengers leave. People hear the news. And then they go to sleep. The next morning, the sun rises. The fields still need tending. The animals still need feeding. The king still has work to do. History changes. Daily life continues. The old king. Robert Bruce's final years were quieter. Not peaceful exactly, but quieter. His health declined. He knew that he would not live forever. He had spent decades thinking about the future. Now the future belonged to his son. David was young. That worried Robert. A kingdom can survive a strong king. It is much harder to know whether it can survive a weak succession. So Robert's attention turned towards securing the dynasty. He arranged marriages. He strengthened political alliances. He continued to manage the kingdom. But his body was failing. The warrior who had spent years sleeping in the open country was now confined by illness. The contrast is almost painful. The man who could outrun an army could not outrun time. Death. Robert Bruce died on June 7, 1329. He was about 54. His reign had lasted 23 years. His body was buried at Dunfermline Abbey. A tomb was prepared. The king was placed beneath the stone. And the kingdom continued. His son became king. The court moved on. The political world moved on. The people moved on. But Robert's story remained. And over the centuries, it became larger. The making of a legend. Every generation reshapes its heroes. Robert Bruce was no exception. The medieval chroniclers remembered him. Later Scottish writers remembered him. Poets remembered him. Historians remembered him. Artists remembered him. Eventually, films remembered him. Each generation emphasized something different. The warrior. The king. The patriot. The survivor. The strategist. The symbol. But underneath all those versions is the same basic story. A man entered a political struggle. He made catastrophic mistakes. He suffered terrible defeats. He nearly lost everything. And then he changed. That change is the heart of the story. Because Bruce did not win Bannockburn by becoming more reckless. He won because he became more patient. He learned. He adapted. He understood his enemy. He understood his own limitations. And he stopped trying to fight the war the way his enemy expected. That may be his greatest achievement. Not bravery. Adaptation. The Scottish landscape remembers. Today, when people visit places connected with Robert Bruce, the landscape can seem strangely peaceful. Bannockburn is quiet. Stirling is quiet. Dunfermline is quiet. Melrose is quiet. The Highlands are quiet. The same hills that once hid fugitives now host hikers. The same rivers that once carried armies now carry fishermen's boats. The same castles that once housed soldiers now contain tourists taking photographs. It is difficult to imagine the noise, the shouting, the smoke, the smell of horses, the mud, the fear, the uncertainty. But perhaps that is exactly why these places matter. They remind us that history happened somewhere. Not in a book. Not in an abstract timeline. On actual ground. Under actual rain. In actual darkness. People stood there. They waited. They made decisions. They were afraid. They hoped. They survived. And eventually, they became history. The last lesson. If there is a lesson in Robert Bruce's life, perhaps it is not that courage always wins. History does not promise that. Many courageous people lose. Many brave people die. Many kingdoms disappear. Bruce himself came remarkably close to disappearing. The lesson may instead be that failure does not always have the final word. Robert Bruce lost battles, He lost allies. He lost family members. He lost castles. He lost political standing. He lost almost everything. But he retained one thing: the willingness to continue. That alone was not enough. He also needed strategy, luck, support, resources, and an opponent who made mistakes. History is rarely the product of one virtue. It is a tangled collection of circumstances. But persistence gave Bruce the opportunity to use those circumstances when they finally turned in his favor. And perhaps that is why the story has lasted. Because most people understand failure. Most people understand uncertainty. Most people understand what it feels like to look at a problem and wonder whether it is simply too large. Robert Bruce's world was larger than him. England was more powerful. His enemies were numerous. His first attempt at kingship nearly ended in disaster. And yet he kept going. Eventually, the balance changed. Night falls again. And now, once more, imagine Scotland at night. The mountains are dark. The valleys are covered in mist. The last light has vanished from the western horizon. A river moves quietly through the valley. The wind touches the grass. There are no armies. No banners. No kings. No English soldiers searching the roads. No Scottish rebels hiding in the forests. Only darkness. And perhaps somewhere in that silence, if we listen carefully enough, we can imagine the faintest echo of the old world. A horse. A distant bell. The crackle of a fire. The murmur of men speaking quietly. Then nothing. The centuries close over them. Robert Bruce is gone. Edward I is gone. Edward II is gone. Wallace is gone. Comyn is gone. The men who fought at Bannockburn are gone. The people who watched the armies pass are gone. Almost everyone who ever knew them is gone. But the story remains. And perhaps that is what history really is. Not a way of making the dead live forever. We cannot do that. It is simply a way of remembering that they were once alive. They stood beneath the same sky. They felt the same cold. They worried about tomorrow. They loved people. They lost people. They hoped for better days. And then, eventually, they disappeared into the quiet. Robert Bruce's story is therefore not only a story about Scotland. It is a story about uncertainty. About how little anyone knows when they are living through history. Robert did not know that Bannockburn would become legendary. The soldier at Bannockburn did not know historians would still discuss him 7 centuries later. The farmer whose field became a battlefield did not know that people would someday stand there with cameras. They simply lived. And that is perhaps the strangest thing of all. We know the ending. They did not. Every morning of Robert Bruce's life arrived without telling him what would happen next. When he was crowned, he did not know he would become a fugitive. When he fled into the Highlands, he did not know he would return. When he faced the English army, he did not know he would win. When he signed the peace treaty, he did not know how long it would last. And when he lay dying, he could not know exactly what history would make of him. None of us can. That is the quiet thread connecting us to the medieval world. They lived in uncertainty. So do we. They watched the future approach one day at a time. So do we. The difference is simply that their future has already become our past. And so, as the night deepens, we can leave Robert Bruce there. Not as a statue. Not as a perfect hero. But as a man. A complicated man. A stubborn man. A political man. A frightened man. A determined man. A king who once had no kingdom. And a fugitive who eventually returned home. The fire burns lower. The wind moves across the hills. The old stones hold the nights cold. The battlefield is empty. The castle is silent. The king is asleep beneath the earth. And Scotland is still there. Still green. Still wet. Still windy. Still impossibly beautiful beneath the enormous northern sky. The story has ended. But the landscape continues. And somewhere beyond the darkness, morning is waiting. Quietly. Patiently. As it always does. Good night. The years between the battles. The night has grown deeper now. The sort of night when the world outside your window begins to feel slightly unreal. Traffic has thinned. The lights in neighboring windows have gone dark. Somewhere, a refrigerator hums. A distant dog barks once, apparently having discovered something of enormous importance, and then decides it can wait until morning. And while the modern world settles down around us, we can return to medieval Scotland. Not to Bannockburn yet. Not to the famous moments. Instead, let us go back to the years when Robert Bruce was still becoming Robert Bruce. Because kings are rarely made in a single afternoon. They are assembled slowly. By childhood. By family. By disappointments. By people they admire. By people they hate. By mistakes they spend years trying to undo. And sometimes, inconveniently, by circumstances completely outside their control. Robert Bruce was born into precisely such a world. A world in which the Scottish throne was not simply a crown. It was an enormous question. Who had the right to wear it? Who had the right to decide? And perhaps most importantly, who had enough soldiers to make everyone else accept the answer? That last question tended to be rather useful in medieval politics. A kingdom at the edge of Europe. Scotland in the late 13th century sat at the northern edge of a larger European world. To the south was England. Across the sea were Ireland and the lands of Western Europe. Ships carried people and goods between ports. Churchmen traveled. Merchants traveled. Nobles traveled. News traveled, although rather more slowly than we are accustomed to. A message that can cross the world instantly today might once have taken days or weeks. And if the messenger fell off his horse, which was not impossible, the message could become considerably delayed. Scotland itself was a patchwork of regions. The lowlands were increasingly connected to the political and economic world of England and continental Europe. The Highlands had different languages, traditions, and political structures. The Western Islands were tied strongly to the maritime world. The North had its own powerful families. There was no single Scottish experience. A merchant in Berwick lived differently from a farmer in the Highlands. A nobleman in Ayrshire lived differently from a fisherman on the western coast. A monk in a monastery lived differently from a shepherd on a hillside. Yet all of them existed within a kingdom whose political independence was becoming increasingly important. And at the top of that kingdom sat a monarchy. Until, suddenly, it didn't. The children of kings. Alexander III had ruled Scotland for decades. His reign had brought stability. But stability can be deceptive. It often depends on one person continuing to hold everything together. When Alexander died unexpectedly in 1286, the kingdom immediately discovered how much depended on him. There was an heir. Margaret, the Maid of Norway. She was young. Very young. But medieval dynasties were perfectly comfortable placing enormous political expectations upon children. Children could be heirs. Children could be kings. Children could inherit entire kingdoms. They just couldn't sign many documents without an adult standing nearby. Margaret never reached Scotland. She died at sea in 1290. And suddenly the future of Scotland was uncertain. The great families looked toward the throne. The Bruce family looked toward the throne. The Balliol family looked toward the throne. Other nobles watched carefully. The church watched. England watched. And Edward I watched most closely of all. Edward's opportunity. Edward I understood power. He had spent years strengthening royal authority in England. He had conquered Wales. He had fought wars. He had developed a formidable administrative machine. When Scotland needed someone to decide its succession, Edward saw an opportunity. He would arbitrate. But before he would do so, he demanded that the Scottish nobles acknowledge him as overlord. This was the first step. And it was a dangerous one. Once Edward had established that principle, he could claim that Scottish kings were subordinate to him. The Scottish nobles accepted because they desperately needed a decision. They probably hoped the arrangement would be temporary. History would prove otherwise. Edward examined the competing claims. The process was elaborate. Genealogies were studied. Legal arguments were presented. Witnesses were consulted. The entire matter was treated with the seriousness of a major legal dispute. And eventually Edward chose John Balliol. The Bruce family had lost. Robert Bruce's grandfather was disappointed. But the political situation remained fluid. Balliol became king, and almost immediately discovered that Edward did not intend to treat him like an equal. The humiliation of King John. Edward summoned Balliol. He demanded obedience. He interfered in Scottish affairs. He treated the Scottish king as though he were a subordinate lord. Balliol protested. Edward responded with more pressure. The relationship deteriorated. Eventually the Scottish nobles rebelled against Edward's authority. They formed alliances. They prepared for war. And Edward did what Edward tended to do when someone challenged him. He invaded. The English army crossed the border. Berwick fell. The Scottish army was defeated. Balliol surrendered. The royal symbols were stripped from him. His reign ended. And Edward believed he had solved the Scottish problem. He had not. He had merely made it angrier. Robert Bruce and the question of loyalty. For Robert Bruce, these events created an uncomfortable problem. He was a Scottish nobleman. But his family had lands and connections in England. He was not simply choosing between two abstract nations. He was protecting a family inheritance. This is one reason the early years of Robert's political career can look confusing to modern readers. He sometimes supported Edward. Sometimes he resisted him. Sometimes he cooperated with Scottish resistance. Sometimes he pursued his own interests. It is tempting to look backward and say, surely he always knew he would become Scotland's great liberator. No. He didn't. History rarely works like that. People make decisions with incomplete information. Robert did not know which side would win. He did not know whether Scotland would remain independent. He did not know whether the Bruce claim would ever succeed. He certainly did not know that one day people would build monuments to him. He was simply a powerful young nobleman trying to navigate an increasingly dangerous political world. William Wallace appears. Then came William Wallace. Wallace's rebellion was different from the political maneuvering of the great noble families. His resistance became military. The English administration found itself under attack. Scottish forces gathered. And at Stirling Bridge, the Scots achieved a remarkable victory. The English army was defeated. The bridge became a trap. The Scottish commanders had chosen their moment. Wallace became famous. His reputation grew rapidly. Robert Bruce could not ignore him. But neither could Bruce simply surrender his own political ambitions. There was room for cooperation. There was also room for rivalry. The Scottish leadership remained divided. And the English king was determined to crush the rebellion. Edward returned. At Falkirk, the English defeated Wallace. The balance shifted again. Wallace's political position weakened. Robert Bruce became more important. But his greatest rival was now not Wallace. It was John Comyn. The Comyns. The Comyn family was powerful. Very powerful. John Comyn had royal connections. His family had supported the Balliol claim, and that made him a natural opponent of Robert Bruce. The two men were not merely disagreeing over tactics. They represented competing political futures. If the Balliol line returned, the Comyn family would gain influence. If Bruce became king, the Comyns would lose. The stakes were enormous. This was not a disagreement that could easily be solved with a polite conversation over dinner. Although medieval nobles did enjoy very long dinners, so perhaps they tried. For years, Bruce and Comyn maneuvered around one another. The English occupation continued. Scottish resistance continued. The political situation became increasingly complicated. And then, in 1304, Edward's forces captured Stirling Castle. Most of Scotland was back under English control. Robert Bruce was faced with a choice: continue compromising, or take the throne. The meeting at Greyfriars. February 1306. Dumfries. Greyfriars Kirk. Robert Bruce met John Comyn. We do not know everything that was said. The surviving accounts differ. There may have been accusations of betrayal. There may have been discussion of Bruce's plans. Perhaps Bruce wanted Comyn's support. Perhaps Comyn refused. Perhaps he threatened to reveal Bruce's intentions to Edward. The argument escalated. Bruce stabbed Comyn. The wounded man was taken toward the altar. Bruce's companions returned. Comyn was killed. And suddenly, Robert Bruce's future was decided. There was no going back. He had killed his most powerful Scottish rival. He had done it inside a church. He had placed himself directly against English authority. And if he wanted to survive, he needed something larger than survival. He needed the crown. The road to Scone. Robert Bruce was crowned in March 1306. The ceremony took place at Scone. But it was not the kind of royal coronation we might imagine. There was no sense of secure permanence. The stone of destiny was missing. Edward had taken it years earlier. The English were coming. Bruce's enemies were numerous. And yet the crown was placed upon his head. He was now King of Scots. For a few moments, perhaps, the world seemed to make sense. The Bruce claim had succeeded. But medieval kingship was not merely a ceremony. A king needed power. And Bruce had very little. His army was inexperienced. His political support was fragile. His enemies were stronger. Edward I was determined to destroy him. The new king had barely begun when the English response arrived. Methven. The English commander Aymer de Valence moved against Bruce. The Scottish army was caught unprepared. The result was disaster. The Scots were defeated. Bruce escaped. His army scattered. His position became desperate. But he tried again. Another battle followed at Dalry. Another defeat. The new king was losing. His supporters were disappearing. Some surrendered. Some fled. Some changed sides. The English hunted him. Bruce's family was captured. His brothers were executed. His wife and daughter were taken prisoner. His sisters were imprisoned. Isabella Macduff was punished for participating in his coronation. The message was unmistakable. Edward wanted to erase Robert Bruce from history before he could become a problem. It almost worked. The king in the wild. Bruce fled west. And now the story changes. The royal court disappears. The castles disappear. The ceremony disappears. What remains is wilderness. Forest. Mountain. Sea. Rain. Cold. Darkness. The king traveled with a small group of followers. They had little security. They could not trust every village. They could not assume food would be available. They could not light large fires without attracting attention. Every journey was dangerous. Every stranger might be a spy. Every distant rider might be an enemy. Imagine the psychological strain. You have been crowned king. Your family is imprisoned. Your brothers are dead. Your enemies control much of the country. And you are hiding in the landscape. The title, King of Scots, must have felt almost absurd. A king without a castle. A king without a court. A king with no secure bed. And yet this period transformed Robert. Learning the landscape. The Highlands and Western Islands offered Bruce something England could not easily control. Space. A large army requires roads. It requires supplies. It requires animals. It requires predictable routes. A small group requires much less. Bruce began to understand the geography. He moved quickly. He relied upon supporters. He avoided unnecessary battles. He struck where the enemy was weak. And slowly, his reputation changed. People who had once considered him finished began to wonder whether he might survive. Then they began to wonder whether he might actually win. That is how rebellions grow. Not all at once. First someone whispers that the king is still alive. Then someone says he defeated a patrol. Then someone says a castle has fallen. Then another noble joins him. Then another. And suddenly, the rebellion that seemed dead is alive again. The spider story. This is where the famous spider enters. According to later tradition, Bruce was hiding in a cave. He watched a spider attempt to spin its web. The spider failed. Again. And again. And again. Eventually it succeeded. Bruce supposedly took this as a lesson. Try again. The story is probably not historically reliable. But it has survived because it captures something real. Robert Bruce did try again. And again. He did not win because a spider gave him military advice. The spider was not, fortunately, appointed chief strategist. He won because he learned from his failures. He stopped relying on conventional methods. He stopped trying to defeat England by simply meeting English armies head-on. Instead, he made the war difficult, slow, expensive, unpredictable. And that was exactly what he needed. A new strategy. Bruce began destroying English-controlled castles. But not always by holding them. Sometimes the castles were dismantled. This sounds strange. Why destroy a fortress instead of keeping it? Because a castle captured by Scotland could later be recaptured by England. A ruined castle was much harder to use. Bruce understood that control of Scotland did not require occupying every stone. It required denying the enemy the ability to use those stones. So castles were damaged. Walls were broken. Towers were undermined. Garrisons were expelled. The English were forced to rebuild or abandon positions. It was expensive. And every expense mattered. England had enormous resources. But even enormous resources are not infinite. Especially when the king is fighting wars elsewhere. Edward I marches north. Edward I was determined to finish the war personally. He marched north again. But age had caught him. His health was failing. He was no longer the vigorous king who had conquered Wales and marched across Scotland. The campaign continued. Then, in July 1307, Edward died. His son inherited the throne. Edward II. For Scotland, this was an enormous stroke of luck. The most formidable enemy Robert Bruce had ever faced was gone, and his successor lacked his father's determination. Bruce now had time. He needed every bit of it. The return of the king. Robert moved from fugitive to conqueror. One castle after another came under Scottish control. His supporters increased. His authority strengthened. The great families began to reconsider their loyalties. This is another important part of political history. People rarely remain loyal to a losing side forever. A nobleman might be passionately committed to the English king while England appeared victorious. But once Bruce began winning, the calculation changed. The safest political decision might now be supporting Bruce. And once enough nobles made that decision, Bruce became even stronger. This created a cycle. Victory brought supporters. Supporters brought soldiers. Soldiers brought more victories. Victories brought more supporters. Eventually, the rebellion became a government. Robert Bruce was no longer simply resisting English rule. He was rebuilding Scottish rule. The king becomes a soldier. Bruce was an active commander. This mattered. He did not simply send others to fight. He understood warfare personally. He knew how horses moved. He understood infantry formations. He studied terrain. He recognized when to retreat. He recognized when to attack. He learned that a small army could defeat a larger one if the larger army could not use its numbers effectively. This would become crucial at Bannockburn. But before Bannockburn, there were years of smaller battles. Those battles taught the Scottish army. They learned discipline. They learned how to move together. They learned to build defensive positions. They learned how to resist cavalry. And they learned confidence. Confidence is one of the most important things an army can possess. A soldier who believes his formation will hold fights differently from a soldier who expects to run. Bruce needed an army that believed it could stand. The English problem. Edward II had problems of his own. His court was divided. Powerful nobles were suspicious of his favorites. Political disputes distracted the government. Military campaigns were expensive. And Scotland was becoming a persistent problem. Every year the war continued, the English king looked less capable. Every Scottish victory made him weaker. Eventually, the question became unavoidable. How would England defeat Robert Bruce? The answer seemed obvious. Send a large army north. Capture Stirling. Destroy Bruce. End the rebellion. Which, naturally, was exactly what Robert wanted them to do. Stirling. Stirling Castle was strategically vital. It sat at a crossroads between different parts of Scotland. Whoever controlled Stirling could influence movement across the kingdom. The Scottish forces had surrounded it. The English garrison was under pressure. A deadline was agreed. If the castle was not relieved by midsummer, it would surrender. Edward II could not allow that. The English army began gathering. And as it marched north, Robert Bruce prepared. He knew he was about to face the largest English army he had ever seen. He also knew something else. He did not need to destroy every English soldier. He needed to make the army unable to fight effectively. That distinction was everything. The ground. Bruce chose ground near Bannockburn. Streams. Wet ground. Uneven terrain. Woodland. Limited space. The landscape restricted cavalry. The English army would have difficulty deploying all its forces at once. This meant the English advantage in numbers could be reduced. Imagine having 10,000 men but only enough room for 2,000 to fight effectively. Suddenly, 10,000 is not quite as useful. The Scots understood this. The English had to come forward. The Scottish army waited. And then the fighting began. The first encounter. On the first day, an English force advanced. Bruce's army was ready. The fighting became intense. The famous encounter between Bruce and Henry de Bohun occurred. Bohun charged. Bruce waited. Then, at the last possible moment, Bruce moved. His weapon struck. The English knight fell. Bruce survived. His soldiers saw it. The story says his weapon broke. Later, his men supposedly complained that he had risked himself. The king apparently replied that he had lost a good weapon. Perhaps. Perhaps not. But the story survived because it was useful. The king was not hiding behind his soldiers. He was with them. That mattered. Night. The first day's fighting ended. Night descended. The armies rested. Some men slept. Some could not. The Scottish camp was probably filled with quiet conversation. The English camp was filled with thousands of soldiers. Some expected victory in the morning. Others were uncertain. Robert Bruce knew the next day would be decisive. There would be no easy retreat. The English army was between him and the future he wanted. If he lost, everything could collapse. If he won, Scotland's independence could become realistic. The firelight flickered across shields. The horses breathed in the cold night air. The grass was wet. The stars appeared overhead. And somewhere beyond the camp, the English army waited. Morning was coming. The second day. The Scottish army formed. The schiltrons moved forward. Spears pointed outward. The formation was compact. Disciplined. Difficult to break. English cavalry attacked. The Scots held. Again. And again. The English army struggled to deploy. The ground restricted movement. The Scottish formations advanced. Then the archers were attacked. The English advantage in missile troops was weakened. The battlefield became increasingly chaotic. Men shouted. Orders were lost. Horses panicked. Units collided. And then the English army began to retreat. Retreat became flight. Flight became disaster. The army broke apart. The king fled. The Scots had won. The king who survived. Robert Bruce had gone from fugitive to victorious king. The transformation was extraordinary. But perhaps the most interesting part was that he did not immediately become complacent. He knew England remained powerful. He knew another invasion could come. He knew the political situation was not permanently secure. So he continued the war. Scottish armies entered northern England. They attacked towns. They seized supplies. They carried the war across the border. The goal was pressure. England needed to feel the cost of refusing recognition. This was not simply revenge. It was diplomacy conducted with an army. And eventually it worked. The Declaration. In 1320, Scottish nobles and churchmen sent a letter to Pope John XXII. It became known as the Declaration of Arbroath. Its language was remarkable. It described Scotland as an ancient kingdom. It defended Robert Bruce. It insisted that Scotland had a right to independence. And it contained a statement that would become famous. The king's legitimacy was tied to his defense of the kingdom. If he failed in that duty, the Scottish political community could replace him. That was not modern democracy. But it was a powerful statement. The kingdom mattered. The kings served the kingdom. Robert Bruce was not simply fighting for his own crown. At least in the political language of the Declaration, the crown existed within a larger community. Scotland was the thing that had to survive. Peace. By the late 1320s, both kingdoms wanted peace. England had its own problems. Robert Bruce's health was failing. The Treaty of Edinburgh and Northampton was concluded in 1328. Scotland's independence was recognized. Robert Bruce was recognized as King of Scots. The war was over. After decades of conflict, the political question that had begun with the death of Alexander III finally had an answer. Scotland would remain a separate kingdom. Robert Bruce had won the last journey. But Robert's story was nearly finished. He was ill. He had spent years campaigning. His body had endured hardship that would be difficult for anyone. He traveled less. He spent more time at Cardross. The king who had once crossed the Highlands under cover of darkness now faced a different enemy. Time. There is something almost cruelly ordinary about the final enemy of a great historical figure. You can defeat armies. You can survive exile. You can escape assassins. You can outmaneuver kings. But eventually the body says no. Robert Bruce died in 1329. His kingdom survived. His son inherited the crown. And the king became memory. The heart. Robert had wanted to go on crusade. He had not managed to do so during his lifetime. His heart was carried after his death by James Douglas. Douglas traveled towards Spain and joined a Christian campaign. He died there. The story says he carried Robert's heart with him. The heart was eventually returned to Scotland. It was buried at Melrose. There is something poetic about that. A king's heart traveling farther after death than he had been able to travel during life. A final journey. Not for conquest. Not for politics. Simply because his companions wanted to fulfill his wish. And perhaps that is enough. The kingdom after Bruce. Robert's death did not end Scotland's troubles. His son David too was still a child. Political rivals returned. The English crown continued to watch Scotland. The independence Robert had secured would need to be defended again. But that is not a failure of Robert's achievement. No king can freeze history. No treaty lasts forever simply because one person wants it to. The world changes. People change. Alliances change. And yet Robert had left behind something powerful. A recognized independent kingdom. A political tradition. A national memory. A story. And stories can be surprisingly durable. 7 centuries later. Today, the name Robert the Bruce is immediately recognizable. The details may be forgotten. The dates may become blurred. But the broad outline remains. A Scottish king. A war for independence. A terrible defeat. A period in hiding. A return. Bannockburn. Victory. Independence. It has the shape of a legend because it contains everything legends usually need. A fallen hero. A desperate exile. An impossible comeback. A final victory. And a kingdom saved. But the real story is more complicated. Robert was not perfect. He made mistakes. He killed a rival. He changed political sides. He lost battles. He sometimes acted from personal ambition. He was capable of ruthlessness. He was also capable of extraordinary determination. The interesting thing about historical people is that they do not need to be perfect to matter. In fact, they are often more interesting because they aren't. The man beneath the monument. Imagine removing the statue. Remove the crown. Remove the sword. Remove the heroic pose. Remove the later legends. What remains? A man born into a powerful family. A man who grew up watching his kingdom become unstable. A man who wanted a crown. A man who made a terrible political decision. A man who lost nearly everything. A man who ran. A man who learned. a man who returned. A man who built an army. A man who won. And eventually, a man who grew old and died. That is Robert Bruce. Not a myth. Not quite. A human being who happened to live through an extraordinary period. The quiet battlefield. And now we can return one last time to Bannockburn. Not to the battle. To the place afterward. Imagine the field centuries later. Grass moving in the wind. Rain beginning. Clouds passing over the hills. No army. No banners. No shouting. Just the land. Perhaps a bird moves across the sky. Perhaps someone walks quietly along the path. The battlefield does not remember the soldiers in the way we imagine. The grass does not know who won. The soil does not care which king wore which crown. Nature does not preserve political victories. It simply continues. And perhaps that is why the story feels so distant. We know the outcome. But for the people who lived through it, the outcome was uncertain. That uncertainty is the part we should remember. Because we are always living inside our own uncertainty. We never know which moment will become important. Which decision will matter. Which failure will teach us something. Which person we meet will change our lives. History only becomes clear afterward. Robert Bruce could not see the shape of his own story. Neither can we see ours. The last night. So let the story become quiet now. Let the roads of medieval Scotland empty. Let the soldiers go home. Let the banners fold. Let the castles fall into darkness. The old king is beneath the earth. His sword is silent. His armies are gone. His enemies are gone. His friends are gone. The arguments have ended. The treaties have become parchment. The parchment has become history. And history has become memory. Outside, the Scottish hills remain. The wind moves slowly through the grass. A stream passes beneath an old bridge. Clouds drift across the moon. Far away, the sea continues its endless movement against the shore. 7 centuries ago, men stood beneath these same stars and wondered what tomorrow would bring. Tonight, we know what came next. But they did not. They simply waited for morning. And perhaps that is where we should leave them. Waiting. Not as statues. Not as heroes carved into stone. But as people. Cold. Tired. Hopeful. Afraid. Alive. And then, slowly, the centuries close around them. The fire burns down. The road disappears into mist. The castle becomes a silhouette. The hills become shadows. And the story becomes quieter. Quieter still. Until all that remains is the sound of wind across the grass. And somewhere beneath that grass, beneath those ancient stones, beneath the long memory of Scotland, a king is finally resting. Robert the Bruce. The man who lost almost everything. The man who returned. The man who won. And the man whose greatest victory was perhaps not that he defeated England at Bannockburn, but that when his own story was finished, the country he had fought for was still standing. Still Scotland. Still independent. Still there. And now the night can have the final word. The hills are dark. The rivers are quiet. The last fire has gone out. And the old kingdom sleeps. Good night. What remained after the king? There is a strange thing about the end of a great historical life. We tend to imagine that the story should become peaceful immediately. The hero has won. The kingdom has been secured. The enemy has been defeated. The treaty has been signed. And so, surely, everyone goes home, the violins begin, and history politely closes the book. Unfortunately, history has never been particularly polite. Robert the Bruce had won independence for Scotland, but he had not won permanence. No medieval king could. The kingdom he left behind was still vulnerable, still surrounded by powerful neighbors, and still governed by human beings who possessed the remarkable ability to disagree with one another almost immediately after reaching an agreement. Robert had spent much of his adult life learning this lesson. A victory was never simply a victory. It created a new situation. And the new situation created new problems. So as we bring his story to its final resting place, it is worth looking beyond the famous death of the king and asking the quieter question. What actually remained? What did Robert Bruce leave behind? And what did Scotland become after the man himself was gone? The answer is more complicated than a statue in a town square might suggest. And perhaps because it is late, we can take our time with it. There is no need to hurry. The armies are gone. The banners are folded. The battlefield is empty. We can simply walk through the years. Slowly. The young king. When Robert Bruce died in 1329, his son David was still a child. David too was only about 5 years old. And this was not ideal. Medieval kingdoms were not particularly fond of child kings. Children could inherit crowns. They were considerably less useful at governing kingdoms. Someone else had to make decisions. Someone else had to command armies. Someone else had to negotiate with nobles. Someone else had to decide which powerful aristocrat was becoming too powerful and might need a polite warning. Or, more likely, several heavily armed men standing nearby. The guardians of the young David had enormous responsibilities. And Robert's carefully constructed political settlement immediately faced pressure. Because England was still England. The English crown had not forgotten Scotland. And there were Scottish nobles who had their own ambitions. One of them was Edward Balliol. Yes. That name again. History sometimes has a sense of humor. The son of John Balliol, the king whom Robert's family had opposed, Edward Balliol now claimed the Scottish throne. The old rivalry had not disappeared. It had simply been waiting. The Second War of Independence. In 1332, Edward Balliol invaded Scotland with English support. The Scottish forces were caught off guard. At Duplin Moor, Balliol's army won. The young David too was now in danger. Balliol was crowned king. For a moment, it looked as though Robert Bruce's work might unravel. But Scotland had changed. There were now political institutions, alliances, and memories that had not existed in the same form before Bruce's reign. Supporters of David resisted. The war continued. And once again Scotland became a country divided by rival claims to the crown. The young David was eventually sent to France for safety. He was a child king in exile. Far from home. Far from the Scottish landscape. Far from the castles and hills that his father had fought so hard to control. The political struggle continued without him. And eventually, David returned. But his reign would be very different from his father's. Robert Bruce had built his power through war. David inherited the results. That can be a difficult inheritance. Because the son receives the kingdom without receiving the experiences that created it. The shadow of the father. Imagine growing up as the son of Robert Bruce. Everyone knows your father's name. Everywhere you go, people remember what he did. He defeated the English. He became king after years of struggle. He survived exile. He won Bannockburn. He secured recognition of Scottish independence. And now you are expected to continue his work. No matter what you do, someone is likely to compare you with him. History can be a cruel parent. It gives children impossible ancestors. David too was not Robert Bruce. He did not have to be. But Scotland had been shaped around Robert's reputation, and David had to govern within that shadow. His reign would involve renewed conflict with England. capture, negotiation, financial pressure, and eventually another period of political instability. The story continued. It simply became less romantic. Which, as you may have noticed, is usually what happens after the hero dies. The Bruce legacy. Robert Bruce's greatest political achievement was not that he created a perfect Scotland. He did not. It was that he made Scottish independence politically real. Before his reign, independence could seem like an aspiration. After his reign, it was an established fact recognized by England. That distinction matters. Robert had transformed the political balance. He had created a dynasty. He had secured international recognition. He had strengthened the Scottish monarchy. He had helped establish the idea that Scotland could exist as an independent kingdom without needing permission from a stronger neighbor. And this was not simply a matter of pride. Independence meant control over laws, taxes, diplomacy, succession, trade, war. The ability to decide what happened inside the kingdom. For medieval people, these were not abstract concepts. They affected their lives. A tax collector belonged to a particular government. A court followed a particular legal system. A merchant depended upon political stability. A nobleman needed to know whom he served. A farmer wanted to know whether an army was going to cross his fields. The king's victory therefore mattered far beyond the castle walls. But Scotland was not suddenly free of trouble. The word freedom can sound very simple. In practice, it rarely is. Scotland remained a medieval kingdom. Most people were not participating in government. Most people were farmers. Many lived hard lives. Life expectancy was limited. Disease was common. Child mortality was high. Harvests could fail. Weather could destroy crops. Political stability did not eliminate hunger. Independence did not eliminate poverty. Robert Bruce had not created a paradise. He had created a political future. That distinction is important. The kingdom still had problems. But those problems would now be faced by a Scottish government. That was the achievement. The people who were never in the chronicles. When we talk about Robert Bruce, we naturally focus on kings, nobles, knights, and commanders. But most people in medieval Scotland never met him. They never stood inside a royal court. They never saw Bannockburn. They never spoke to a nobleman. They simply lived. They planted crops. They harvested grain. They raised animals. They repaired roofs. They attended church. They married. They buried relatives. They worried about winter. And when armies came through their region, they endured the consequences. Their names are mostly lost. This is one of the quiet tragedies of medieval history. The people who made kingdoms function are often the people history remembers least. Robert Bruce could not have maintained an army without farmers. He could not have fed his court without workers. He could not have moved supplies without laborers. He could not have maintained castles without craftsmen. He could not have ruled without the enormous invisible structure of ordinary life beneath the monarchy. The king appears at the top of the story. But the kingdom existed because thousands of people kept waking up every morning and doing what needed to be done. Scotland after Bannockburn. The Battle of Bannockburn became symbolic. But the war did not end there. That is worth repeating. The battle was a turning point. It was not a magic spell. England still possessed immense resources. Scottish forces continued campaigning. Diplomacy continued. Raids continued. Castles changed hands. Political negotiations continued. Robert needed to turn military victory into political recognition. That took years. The Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton finally provided that recognition in 1328. This is another reason to remember that Bannockburn was not the entire story. The battle was spectacular. The treaty was quieter. But the treaty was arguably just as important. A battlefield victory can be reversed. A diplomatic settlement can establish a new political reality. Robert needed both. The crown and the kingdom. One of the most interesting things about Robert's legacy is the relationship between the king and the kingdom. Robert's supporters defended him partly because they believed he was the legitimate ruler. But they also defended the independence of Scotland itself. This became increasingly important in Scottish political thought. The Declaration of Arbroath expressed the idea that the community of Scotland mattered. The king was important. But the kingdom was larger than the king. This idea would develop over centuries. The medieval world was not democratic in the modern sense. It was hierarchical. But political communities still had identities. Laws still mattered. Customs mattered. Institutions mattered. The idea that Scotland existed as a distinct political community became stronger. And Robert Bruce became attached to that idea. The castle after dark. Imagine Dunfermline Abbey now. Night. The stone walls are pale under the moon. The grass is damp. The air is cool. The place has been rebuilt and changed many times. Centuries of people have walked through. Kings. Queens. Monks. Soldiers, visitors, tourists, children, historians, people who came because they knew exactly what they were looking at, people who came because they were simply passing through. Somewhere beneath the church lies Robert Bruce. Not the dramatic warrior from the stories. Just bones. A body that once grew tired. A heart that once beat faster before battle. Hands that once held a sword. Eyes that once looked across a battlefield. All of that has become silence. The man who spent so much of his life trying to control events could no longer control what happened next. And that is the final equality of history. Kings and farmers eventually become equally quiet. The tomb. Robert's original tomb was elaborate. He had been buried with the honors appropriate to a king. But centuries passed. Wars came. Religious changes came. Buildings changed. The medieval world disappeared. The Reformation transformed Scotland. Monasteries were affected. Old religious institutions were altered. The tomb itself was damaged over time. The physical remains of the medieval king did not remain untouched. That too is part of history. We often imagine the past as something preserved perfectly. It isn't. Stone breaks. Buildings collapse. Records disappear. Graves are disturbed. Memories change. The physical world is always erasing what came before. Which means that remembering people is partly an act of resistance against forgetting. Not because we can preserve everything. We cannot. But because we choose to keep some stories alive. Robert Bruce in Scottish memory. Over the centuries, Robert Bruce became more than a historical king. He became an emblem. Poets wrote about him. Historians interpreted him. Artists painted him. Monuments were built. His name became attached to Scottish identity. The famous spider story became part of the popular imagination. The Battle of Bannockburn became a symbol of national independence. The crown became part of the mythology. And eventually, Robert Bruce entered modern popular culture. This is where history becomes especially interesting. Because every generation asks its own questions. A medieval writer might ask whether Bruce was a legitimate king. An 18th-century historian might ask what his reign meant for the development of Scotland. A 19th century writer might emphasize national identity. A 20th century filmmaker might focus on heroism. A modern historian might ask about social structures, political institutions, or the experiences of ordinary people. The same Robert Bruce can therefore appear very different depending on who is telling the story. The historical man remains, but the meaning attached to him changes. The danger of heroes. There is a temptation to make Robert Bruce flawless, to make him noble in every moment, wise in every decision, brave without fear, certain of his destiny. That version is easier to tell. It is also less interesting. The real Robert Bruce lived in a world where people made choices with incomplete information. He was ambitious. He was political. He was capable of violence. He changed alliances. He made mistakes. He took enormous risks. Sometimes those risks succeeded. Sometimes they nearly destroyed him. That makes his story more human. Because a perfect hero teaches us very little. A complicated human being who fails, adapts, survives, and eventually succeeds gives us something much more useful. A sense of possibility. The long road to Bannockburn. Think back to the young Robert. He did not know what was coming. He could not have imagined the cave. He could not have imagined the defeat at Methven. He could not have imagined losing his brothers. He could not have imagined his family being captured. He could not have imagined living like a fugitive. He could not have imagined watching an English army approach at Bannockburn. And he certainly could not have imagined people hundreds of years later discussing his decisions late at night. History is strange in this way. We know the destination. The people living through it do not. For Robert, every step mattered because he had no idea whether there would be another. When he fled after defeat, he had no guarantee of return. When he gathered supporters, he had no guarantee they would remain loyal. When he fought the English, he had no guarantee he would survive. When he signed the treaty, he had no guarantee his kingdom would remain peaceful. He lived in uncertainty. As all human beings do. We simply have the advantage of hindsight. A king without a kingdom. Perhaps the most powerful image in Robert Bruce's life is not the king on the throne. It is the king without one. A man hiding in the wilderness. A man whose family is imprisoned. A man whose enemies believe he is finished. A man carrying a title that appears meaningless. King of Scots. But where are the Scots? Where is the kingdom? Where is the army? Where is the castle? Where is the crown? And yet the title survives. The idea survives. The man survives. That is why the story can turn. Because he refuses to accept that the visible situation is the final situation. The English control the castles. But they do not control every hill. They control the roads. But they do not control every path. They control much of the kingdom. But they cannot control every person. And Bruce learns to operate inside those spaces. It is almost as though the landscape itself becomes part of the resistance. The mountains hide him. The forests conceal him. The islands protect him. The weather slows his enemies. The rivers divide armies. The terrain becomes an ally. Scotland itself seems to participate in the story. The weather. And then there is the weather. It is easy to overlook weather in history. We treat it like background scenery. But for medieval armies, weather was everything. Rain meant mud. Mud slowed horses. Cold exhausted soldiers. Fog obscured movement. Snow could make roads unusable. Storms could prevent ships from sailing. A dry summer could mean a good harvest. A wet summer could mean hunger. The people of Robert Bruce's time did not control the climate. They lived inside it. Every journey depended upon it. Every army depended upon it. Every harvest depended upon it. The landscape was not merely beautiful. It was practical. It could save you. It could kill you. Robert learned to use it. And perhaps that is one of the quiet reasons his story belongs so strongly to Scotland. The land is never entirely separate from the politics. The sea. The Western Sea also mattered. The islands provided routes of movement. Ships connected communities. A king could disappear across water. An army could not easily follow. The sea offered escape. It also offered danger. Storms. Rocks. Unpredictable winds. But to people who knew the coastline, the sea could become a highway. Robert's survival depended partly on maritime connections. That is another reminder that Scotland was not only mountains and castles. It was also water. A kingdom facing the Atlantic. A kingdom with islands. A kingdom whose people knew how to travel by sea. The map of Robert Bruce's life is therefore not simply a collection of roads. It is a network of water, land, mountain, forest, castle, village, and all of it connected by people. The people who followed him. No king wins alone. Robert had companions, commanders, nobles, soldiers, messengers, sailors, farmers, clergy, people who sheltered him, people who carried information, people who brought food, people who warned him when enemies approached, people who believed that his survival mattered. Some became famous. James Douglas, Thomas Randolph, Edward Bruce, Alexander Seton, and many others. But behind them were thousands whose names were never recorded. History often remembers the commander. It forgets the man who carried his food. It remembers the knight. It forgets the person who repaired the horse. It remembers the king. It forgets the people who kept the kingdom alive while the king was fighting for it. So when we speak of Robert Bruce's victory, we should perhaps imagine not one man standing beneath a banner. We should imagine a crowd. A vast network of people. All making small decisions. All contributing something. All hoping that tomorrow might be better than today. What Bannockburn meant. For the soldiers who fought there, Bannockburn probably meant survival. For Robert, it meant political legitimacy. For Scotland, it became a symbol. For England, it was a humiliating defeat. For later generations, it became a legend. But symbols are not the same thing as events. The actual battle was muddy, confusing, frightening, exhausting. People shouted. Men fell. Horses panicked. Orders became unclear. No one had a bird's-eye view of the entire battlefield. Nobody knew exactly how the day would end. The clean story came later. Victory. Defeat. Hero. Enemy. But the people inside the battle experienced confusion. That is what war is. The clarity comes afterward. And then there was peace. Peace is often less dramatic than war. There is no charging cavalry. No banners. No battlefield. Just documents. Messengers. Meetings. Negotiations. Seals. Promises. But peace can be more difficult than victory. You must persuade people who have spent years fighting that they should stop. You must decide what each side receives. You must decide what happens to prisoners. You must decide what happens to disputed lands. You must decide what happens to royal claims. And everyone must trust the agreement enough to accept it. Robert Bruce eventually achieved that. The Treaty of Edinburgh and Northampton was the formal recognition of what his armies had made possible. Scotland was independent. Robert was king. The English claim was abandoned. For the moment. And after so many years, the kingdom could breathe. A quiet crown. Imagine Robert in the final years of his life. No longer the young man fleeing across the mountains. No longer the desperate king in hiding. No longer the commander preparing for Bannockburn. Now older. Ill. Surrounded by familiar faces. Perhaps listening to the sound of rain. Perhaps hearing the voices of servants in the distance. Perhaps thinking about his son. About the kingdom. About the dead. The men who had followed him were growing older too. Some were already gone. The world that had existed when he was young was disappearing. He had spent decades trying to create a future. Now that future belonged to someone else. That is one of the quiet sadnesses of leadership. You spend your life building something you will not get to see completed. Robert would not see the Scotland of later centuries. He would not see the union of the crowns. He would not see the modern Scottish nation. He would not see the monuments. He would not see tourists standing on battlefields. He would not hear his name spoken by people thousands of miles away. He simply died. As all kings eventually do. The final rest. And so we return to Dunfermline. The night is still. The abbey is dark. The stones have absorbed centuries of rain. Outside, the trees move gently. The wind passes through the branches. The king lies beneath the floor. There is no army around him. No royal court. No political argument. No English threat. No claimant to the throne. Only silence. Perhaps this is the most fitting ending. Because Robert Bruce spent his life surrounded by noise. Battle. Politics. Arguments. Speeches. Horses. Armor. Church bells. Shouting. The clatter of weapons. And then, at the end, silence. The strange persistence of memory. 7 centuries later, Robert Bruce is still remembered. That is not something he could have planned. It is not something he could have controlled. Memory is strange. Sometimes the most important people vanish. Sometimes obscure figures become famous. Sometimes a small story survives while an enormous event disappears. Robert survived because his story was useful. Scotland needed a hero of independence. He became one. But perhaps the deeper reason is that his story contains something universal. The feeling of being defeated. The fear that circumstances have become permanent. The temptation to surrender. The possibility of trying again. That is why people continue to tell these stories. Not because medieval Scotland is directly relevant to every modern life, but because the emotions are failure, hope, fear, ambition, loss, persistence. They belong to every century. The king and the spider. So perhaps the spider story survives for a reason. Not because spiders are particularly good military advisors. Although, to be fair, they are impressively persistent. The story survives because it gives a simple image to something much more complicated. Try again. The first attempt fails. Try again. The second fails. Try again. The web breaks. Try again. Eventually, something holds. Robert Bruce's real achievement was not simply refusing to give up. He also learned how to change. That is more difficult. Trying the same thing repeatedly is not always courage. Sometimes it is just stubbornness. Bruce's strength was that he adapted. He changed his tactics. He changed his alliances. He changed his methods. He learned from defeat. And eventually, he created the conditions for victory. That is a more interesting lesson than simply saying he was brave. The last image. So imagine the Scottish countryside tonight. No battle. No soldiers. No king. Just the land. A field beneath a dark sky. The grass bending slightly in the wind. A stream moving through the valley. Clouds crossing the moon. Somewhere, far away, the sea touches the western shore. The castles are quiet. The old roads are empty. The stones remember more than we do. They have watched kingdoms rise. They have watched kingdoms disappear. They have watched children become kings. They have watched kings become ghosts. Robert Bruce once stood beneath this sky. He was young. He was ambitious. He was uncertain. He made mistakes. He lost. He nearly disappeared. Then he returned. He fought. He won. And eventually, he went to sleep beneath the earth. The kingdom remained. That may be the simplest way to understand his legacy. He did not live forever. He did not create a perfect world. He did not end war. He did not prevent Scotland from suffering again. But he helped ensure that Scotland would face its future as a kingdom in its own right. That was enough. More than enough. The end of the road. History has a strange rhythm. At the beginning, everything seems urgent. A king dies. A throne becomes empty. An army marches. A castle falls. A man is crowned. A man runs. A battle begins. A kingdom hangs in the balance. Everything seems to matter. Then centuries pass. The urgency fades. The people become names. The names become stories. The stories become legends. And eventually, someone sits quietly at night and tells the story again. That is what we have been doing. Walking backward through the centuries. Following a man from childhood to kingship. From kingship to exile. From exile to victory. From victory to peace. And finally, from peace to silence. Robert Bruce's life was not a straight road. It was a winding one. There were wrong turns. Dead ends. Storms. Losses. Unexpected openings. And finally, a destination he could never have been certain he would reach. Perhaps that is why the story feels so alive. Because it does not feel inevitable. And the most interesting histories never do. Good night, Scotland. So now, let the battlefield grow quiet. Let the armies disappear into the mist. Let the banners fall. Let the horses wander home. Let the castle gates close. Let the monks return to their prayers. Let the farmers return to their fields. Let the sea continue moving against the western islands. Let the mountains keep their secrets. And beneath the stones of Dunfermline, let the old king rest. Robert the Bruce. King of Scots. Fugitive. Warrior. Politician. Survivor. A man who once had almost nothing. A man who learned that victory can sometimes begin with simply staying alive long enough to try again. His enemies are gone. His friends are gone. His kingdom has changed. The language has changed. The borders have changed. The world has changed. But the hills remain. The rain still falls. The wind still crosses the fields. The rivers still move toward the sea. And somewhere beneath the modern world, beneath roads and houses and cities, the old Scotland is still there. The Scotland of stone towers and muddy roads. Of smoky halls and cold nights. Of bells ringing across valleys. Of horses carrying messengers through rain. Of men waiting beneath banners. Of a king who once looked across a battlefield and wondered whether his country would survive. It did. Not perfectly. Not forever unchanged. But it survived. And perhaps that is what every generation ultimately asks of the one before it. Not perfection. Not immortality. Simply this. Leave something behind. A kingdom. A story. A memory. A reason for someone, centuries later, to pause in the quiet of the night and remember that you were here. Robert Bruce left all three. And now the story is finished. The fire has gone low. The candles have burned down. The castle is dark. The road disappears into the mist. The last sound is the wind moving gently across the grass. Nothing else is required. The king can sleep. The kingdom can sleep. And for tonight, so can we. Good night.